Nicknamed the Thud for its powerful punch, this wasn't just another fighter. We're talking a supersonic, nuclear-capable fighter-bomber. This beast wasn't just fast, it was supersonic. Designed as a nuclear strike fighter, the Thud became the workhorse of the Vietnam War. Think massive bomb loads, screaming low-level runs, and the guts to take on anything the enemy threw at it. From rolling thunder to daring rescue missions, the F-105 was there. Get ready to meet a true legend of the skies, a jet that earned its stripes the hard way. The Republic F-105 Thunderchief.
This is an F-105G, the wild weasel variant of the Thunderchief, the final evolution of a plane that, upon its debut, was the largest single-engine, single-seat fighter ever built. The F-105 was an incredibly powerful weapon, earning the nickname One-Man Air Force in the skies over Vietnam. Its designer, Alexander Kartveli, was Republic's chief designer and well-versed in large fighter aircraft. Having previously developed the P-47 Thunderbolt in World War II, the biggest single-engine fighter of its time. Produced in vast numbers, the P-47 proved to be a rugged workhorse, excelling not only as an air superiority and escort fighter, but also as a fighter-bomber in tactical support missions. Advanced Project 63, the design studies that led to the F-105, began in 1951 during the height of the Korean War, initially as a privately funded modernization of Republic's F-84. The F-84 had been conceived as a jet-powered Thunderbolt for escort and tactical fighter-bomber roles. In Korea, it struggled against the MiG-15 in escort missions but performed effectively in ground attack. Its straight-wing design was highly conventional, though later versions featured swept wings, better suited for the jet's speed potential. However, with lessons from Korea and the relentless pace of technological advancement pushing them forward, the design team soon realized they were creating an entirely new aircraft. As Republic's engineers embarked on their project, their counterparts at North American had just secured U.S. Air Force backing for the F-100 Super Sabre, the first in the Century series of fighters, designed to fulfill various roles as the Air Force transitioned to supersonic flight. Initially a refinement of the successful F-86 Sabre, the F-100 was first classified as an air superiority fighter, though later versions incorporated fighter-bomber capabilities. With a top speed of 860 miles per hour, the Hun became the U.S. Air Force's first supersonic fighter and proved invaluable in Vietnam, particularly in tactical support missions. Next in line was the McDonnell F-101 Voodoo. Developed as a penetration and escort fighter, the rapid pace of aviation advancements is evident in the fact that, although ordered just a year after the F-100, the F-101 reached a top speed of 1,100 miles per hour. Like its predecessor, later models gained tactical versatility, and it was widely used in Vietnam, most notably for photo reconnaissance. The third Century series fighter was General Dynamics F-102 Delta Dagger, an all-weather interceptor that began development in 1950. Capable of 820 miles per hour, it achieved only moderate success but naturally evolved into the F-106, which boasted a top speed of 1,500 miles per hour. Lockheed's F-104 starfighter, ordered in March 1953, prioritized flight performance above all else as an air superiority fighter. Essentially a manned missile, the 1,400-mile-per-hour F-104 had a turbulent service history but displayed remarkable longevity as a tactical strike and reconnaissance aircraft. At Republic, Kartvelli's team, working on Advanced Project 63, explored 108 design configurations before settling on a single-engine, single-seat tactical fighter bomber capable of carrying nuclear weapons in an internal bomb bay. This aircraft, the F-105A, received Air Force approval in September 1952, initially intended for mass production, though only 2 were ultimately built. Completing the Century series, the F-105 was the first purpose-built tactical strike aircraft ordered for the U.S. Air Force. The need for such an aircraft arose from a mix of Korean battlefield experience, geopolitical shifts, and competition between the U.S. Air Force's strategic and tactical air commands. For TAC, the F-105 not only expanded their conventional mission scope, but also granted them the ability to deliver nuclear weapons over long distances, elevating their prestige to rival that of strategic command. The Tactical Air Command's backing of the F-105 proved crucial as the aircraft navigated its challenging early years. With aviation technology undergoing a complete transformation to meet the demands of supersonic flight, the F-105 faced significant developmental hurdles. What set the massive fighter apart, however, was its vast internal capacity. The atomic bombs it carried, more akin to barrels than traditional weapons, gave it an unmatched level of firepower. For the F-105A, advances in understanding transonic drag, along with certain inherent flaws, led to the design being quickly outdated. It took its first flight more than 3 years after U.S. Air Force approval, by which time its internal systems had been completely overhauled. By then, production of its successor was already in progress. The third F-105 built became the first B model. Seen here on May 26, 1956, it taxis to its takeoff point for its maiden flight. This was the first F-105 to receive an engine powerful enough to match its size, alongside major external modifications. Chief among them was area ruling, which had solved the F-102's drag and turbulence issues. This replaced the A model's straight fuselage with a distinctive wasp waist over the wings. A large 4-pedaled air brake now dominated the once sleek engine exhaust, and modifications to the air intakes gave the Thunderchief its signature nostrils. A larger tail area enhanced stability. These and other modifications resulted in an aircraft capable of reaching twice the speed of sound. Fittingly, its maiden flight was plagued by near-disastrous issues. Planned as a brief circuit, the flight took a dangerous turn when the nosewheel failed to deploy. Repeated attempts to raise and lower the landing gear had no effect. The nosewheel remained stuck. Rather than abandon the aircraft, the decision was made to attempt a belly landing. The test pilot brought the plane down in a long, hazardous skid across the salt flats. As the aircraft finally came to rest, emergency crews rushed in through the clearing dust. The crash was more than just a major embarrassment for a program already criticized as costly and riddled with technical issues. However, it could still be argued that each problem led to improvements that enhanced the aircraft's overall capability. Even as a test platform, the F-105 was revolutionizing not just aviation science, but the future of tactical aircraft. The cause of the crash was quickly traced to the new air intake controls, which, at high thrust settings, jammed the nose wheel in place, a relatively simple issue to fix. One other thing the crash revealed was a trait that those who flew the Thunderchief in combat would come to respect: its durability. The aircraft was lifted, its landing gear was extended, and the prototype was towed away for repairs. Once built, it rejoined the test program as engineers worked to integrate its complex systems and resolve technical issues. They were grappling with forces and concepts that were only just within their control, solving problems as they emerged. It's hard to imagine any other way these theoretical and practical challenges could have been managed amid the rapid pace of technological advancement. As the first aircraft designed for both air-to-air combat and semi-automated air-to-ground weapons delivery, the F-105 depended on avionics systems far beyond anything previously developed. Among its advanced capabilities were radar systems for air search, contour mapping, terrain following, and automatic tracking of both air and ground targets, even in zero-visibility conditions. Throughout its service life, the F-105 continuously received upgrades and new technologies, but from the start, it was a fighter far ahead of its time. The rebuilt aircraft was assigned to the spin testing program, with a spin recovery parachute installed on its tail. This required moving a panel to make space for the chute and eliminating the air brake to ensure an unobstructed deployment if needed. Tests confirmed that the parachute functioned properly. The purpose of spin testing is to verify that an aircraft can recover from a spin and return to stable flight, essentially to ensure that lost control can be regained. Naturally, the first step in such a test is to deliberately lose control of the plane. The test pilot must then sit tight as the aircraft tumbles through the air for a set period before attempting recovery. This is not a job for the faint of heart. Ultimately, the emergency parachute was never required, as the aircraft exhibited unnatural tendency to level out after each revolution, allowing pilots to regain control with relative ease. However, the airframe still needed rigorous testing, so the trials continued. A total of 47 times, pilots released control and watched as the horizon spun away in a dizzying plunge. If you look closely, you'll notice a burst of flame erupting from the aircraft's tail as the engine stalls. Although flight tests progressed well, technical issues persisted, with both the engine and avionics remaining unreliable. This uncertainty in performance was mirrored by broader doubts about the aircraft's future. Initial plans for large-scale production had dwindled to an order of 37 before being cancelled entirely in December 1953. A new order in February 1954 called for 15 aircraft, but by September this had been reduced to 3, only to be increased to 6 the following month. Amid this instability, the operational requirements for the new fighter had already undergone multiple revisions before being officially published in December 1954. By April 1955, they had been altered 3 more times. Despite the project's uncertain future, the test teams continued their work, pushing forward with evaluations. The F-105's already impressive range was further extended with the addition of external fuel tanks, which also required testing to assess their impact on the aircraft and evaluate their own performance. Throughout 1957, testing continued, with the prototype logging extensive flight hours over the desert as the aircraft underwent multiple modifications. The pre-service evaluations, initially scheduled for completion in November 1959, ultimately extended until March 1960. One specification added in 1954 required the F-105 to be capable of in-flight refueling, a relatively new innovation that was already in widespread use. However, for an aircraft like the F-105, this presented a significant challenge. Slowing to match the tanker's speed left the pilot with insufficient airflow over the wings to maintain lift. The top speed of the tanker and the minimum speed of the F-105 were nearly identical, making the fighter difficult to control, especially in the wake turbulence of the larger aircraft, often leading to stalls. Attempts to mitigate the issue by equipping tankers with additional jet engines, as seen here with a modified B-29, provided little improvement. The problem affected all supersonic fighters until jet-powered tankers eventually increased refueling speeds to safer levels. The tests confirmed the challenges faced by the fighter pilot. While some successful couplings were made, the system proved largely impractical, not because of any fault in the F-105, but due to the limitations of the tankers. Moving the drogue from the tail to the wingtip reduced exposure to the larger plane's turbulence, offering some improvement, but the risk of stalling persisted. The long drogue hose in use didn't help ease the process, as it required the fighter pilot to maneuver into position. It wasn't until this method was replaced by a system where the fighter simply maintained its position while the tanker operator directed the connection that refueling became truly practical. The F-105 was equipped with two types of refueling connectors, both of which would see extensive use during the Thunderchief's service. By late 1954, Republic must have been uncertain about the future of the F-105, with their anxiety only slightly alleviated by the bittersweet news they received in February 1955. The order was increased back to 15, with the possibility of fulfilling the rest of the original 34 only if funds became available in the next fiscal year. Adding to the uncertainty was the unsettling condition that the F-105 would have to compete in a fly-off against North American's F-107, an upgraded, high-powered variant of the Super Sabre. The F-107 has often been described as the best fighter never purchased by the U.S. Air Force, and it was undeniably a formidable aircraft. With the same engine as the Thunderchief, it was a highly advanced and powerful design, offering similar performance. However, in the crucial areas of stores carriage and delivery, it lagged behind the F-105, making the competition seem somewhat inconsequential. Had the F-107 been compared to nearly any other aircraft of the time, it might have outperformed it. Yet the F-105 was a unique opponent, and its performance was gradually silencing doubts about its value. The Thunderchief's specifications had undergone continuous revisions, expanding its system's capabilities. Ongoing electronic upgrades ensured that the aircraft remained at the cutting edge of performance throughout its development and operational life. The numerous design changes meant that the first 15 F-105s produced represented 5 distinct subtypes. In the end, there would be 19. Throughout the testing program, these revisions resulted in frequent extensions of the trials. Normal flight testing was completed with minimal issues, as the airframe performed well and exhibited excellent flight characteristics. However, delays were caused by the development of the plane's electronics, as their performance was gradually elevated to meet their intended specifications. With the benefit of hindsight, we can now recognize the exceptional aircraft that was taking shape. Yet at the time there was significant skepticism, and many raised eyebrows regarding the plane's future. On May 28, 1958, 3 years later than initially planned, the U.S. Air Force received its first operational F-105. Fittingly, it became the only one of its subtype. Air Force fighter pilots, initially disappointed to discover their new aircraft was essentially a large bomber, had mockingly dubbed it the Lead Sled, Thunder Thud, or simply Thud. However, Once they got their hands on the plane, their opinion quickly changed. The nickname stuck, but no longer with any negative connotation. The large aircraft became universally loved by its pilots. Not only did it handle and perform like a fighter, but it also packed an impressive punch. When fully loaded, the F-105 could carry up to 14,000 pounds of various external stores, including bombs, rockets, rocket pods, cannon pods, electronic countermeasure packs, air-to-surface missiles, and Sidewinder air-to-air missiles. But perhaps most importantly, the Thunderchief featured a bomb bay. To minimize supersonic drag, the bomb bay doors retracted seamlessly into the aircraft. To ensure the bomb was ejected accurately and clear of the aircraft, it was pushed down using a pneumatic rack. The rack was sturdy enough to serve as a jack for loading the bomb bay when a bomb trolley wasn't available. However, during wartime operations, the Thuds rarely carried bombs internally. Most of the time, the bomb bay was used for additional fuel storage. The outer wings had provisions for 2 stores pylons, which could carry a mix of weaponry and fuel or be removed to make way for specialized racks, like this one for the Sidewinder missile. The standard armament across all Thunderchief's variants was a General Electric M61 20mm multi-barrel gun. This gun fired at an impressive 6,000 rounds per minute, emptying its 1,029 round capacity in under 11 seconds. Deliveries to the Air Force continued, with the 335th Tactical Air Squadron becoming the first unit fully equipped with the new fighter, marking the occasion by setting a world speed record. In 1961, the Thunderchiefs were deployed overseas to bases in Germany. In the summer of 1964, the Thuds saw action for the first time, and soon after they were repainted with new camouflage as they were sent in greater numbers to bases in Thailand and South Vietnam. From these bases, the F-105s launched campaigns that would cement their place in history. For the Thunderchief, Vietnam proved to be the right place at the right time. Despite ongoing reliability issues throughout its service life, culminating in a grounding as late as 1962, the Thud's reputation was far from secure. While these problems were eventually addressed, a series of minor defects and accidents persisted right up until their missions in Vietnam. However, the Thuds in Vietnam quickly earned a very different reputation for being reliable and tough aircraft. They also gained a fearsome status as weapons of war. The significance of the Thunderchief in Vietnam is reflected in the numbers. In the first 5 years of the U.S. Air Force's involvement, the Thuds flew an astonishing 75% of all attack missions. If the skies over Vietnam were filled with bombs, it was the Thuds that put them there. Beginning in March 1965, airstrikes on North Vietnam increased, with most raids focused on communication targets. These missions relied almost entirely on the F-105s. The planes would heave themselves into the air, loaded with bombs, and head for a rendezvous with a tanker near the North Vietnam border. With their heavy loads and the need to fly flat out all the way across Vietnam, rather than cruising to and from their targets, their range was significantly reduced. Even with full tanks, these journeys left little margin for error. Once fueled, the Thuds flew into hostile airspace. At the beginning of the war, the North Vietnamese had limited air defenses, and the early raids were relatively quiet. However, this quickly changed as supplies of anti-aircraft artillery, surface-to-air missiles, and MiG fighters increased, and the raids were soon flown into the heart of one of the most formidable air defense systems ever encountered in warfare. The F-105s pounded enemy bridges, roads, track parks, and military bases, while the Vietnamese responded with powerful defenses. Although the loss rate on individual raids wasn't critical, the process of slow attrition began, and by the end of the conflict, the Thunderchiefs had taken heavy losses. Out of 833 F-105s built, 400 would meet their end in Vietnam. Production of the F-105s was completed in December 1964, with only 78 B models built. The majority, 610, were F-105Ds. The F-105D had an extended nose to accommodate updated all-weather navigation systems, making it externally quite different from the F-105B. The other 143 were the twin-seat F model. Although it had always been expected that a twin-seat version of the F-105 would be developed, 2 earlier proposals for such a version had been dropped. The F models served as the foundation for the later development of the final variant, the F-105G, or Wild Weasel. The workhorse of the bombing raids was the F-105D. The single-seat Ds were abundant at the bases, where war work continued 24 hours a day. After each mission, the returning pilot would confer with his crew chief about the plane's performance and hand it over for servicing. The service record of the F-105s in Vietnam was exemplary. On any given day, over 90% of the Thuds were ready for work, a figure that was higher than the overall average in the U.S. Air Force. Considering the complexity of the aircraft, the workload, and the relative scarcity of these big planes, this performance was truly outstanding. To keep them flying, facilities for complete maintenance were established at the bases, with specialist teams constantly available to fly in for specific issues. Ground crews at the bases carried out normal turnaround routines, refueling, filling the tail's water tank for the afterburner, rearming the aircraft, and other servicing between missions, quickly and efficiently. The body of the plane was a patchwork of hatches, allowing access to the equipment inside. Though the fuselage had little spare room, the layout was sufficiently organized to ensure that servicing the aircraft was relatively straightforward. The bases where the F-105s operated were a far cry from the mud and improvisation of the Second World War. A Thunderchief, parked on a vast expanse of hard stand, could be serviced with relative ease. For each mission, the wing point combinations were selected and adjusted, and the plane was armed in a smooth, practiced routine. A large portion of the bombs dropped in Vietnam were iron bombs from the Second World War. Sadly, these bombs were a product of a design philosophy and era that should have been long outdated. Modern smart bombs didn't make their appearance in Vietnam until the F-111s used them in the final phases of the conflict. As a result, F-105 missions often involved delivering hardware that was uncontrolled in flight, sometimes unstable in trajectory, and frequently unreliable in its effects. But with these bombs, the Thuds hammered the North and, in most instances, successfully destroyed their allocated targets. Throughout the night, the bases were a hive of activity as the work of repairing, servicing, and arming the planes continued. What made the 90% availability of the Thuds even more impressive was their toughness. They kept coming back from missions with major battle damage needing repairs. Thuds sustained strikes from surface-to-air missiles, anti-aircraft artillery, and MiG cannons, yet they survived. In one instance, this aircraft was actually hit by a Sidewinder missile. Each morning, the one-man Air Force was ready, prepared for the next mission. In March 1965, the U.S. Air Force launched the first of the Rolling Thunder series of strikes. The inclusion of Thunder in the name was fitting, as throughout its 3 years, Rolling Thunder was almost entirely the domain of the Thunderchief. The expanded air war in the North had 3 objectives. First, to reduce the infiltration into the South. Second, to pressure the communist leadership in Hanoi. And thirdly, to bolster the morale of the Southern leadership and the people of South Vietnam. As the name implies, the strikes rolled forward into the north, with targets progressively further over the border. And the thunder was real. The damage to the North's bridges, railways, and roads exacted a great cost on the Communists, significantly hampering their war effort. However, although the Hanoi leadership was at times shaken, they did not break. The Thuds flew in on their deadly missions, while the Vietnamese, armed with everything the Russians and Chinese could provide, tried to knock them from the sky. North Vietnam was not an ideal target for a sustained bombing campaign. There was very little industrial infrastructure to damage and almost no war production. The country had an agrarian society, predominantly rural and dispersed. The few major targets, such as docks and storage facilities, were located within the exclusion zones around Hanoi and Haiphong, the 2 major cities. For political reasons, these areas were not bombed for most of the war, as the U.S. consistently tried to negotiate an end to the fighting in the South. The Thud pilots learned their own ways of coping with the streams of surface-to-air missiles that rose at them, splitting and diving to confuse and evade the missiles.
We can take it down. Right to Badger, take it down. We got a launch. Coming off the finish. Well, it's fine. I think we're all right with the time then. Putting it up looks good. Okay, Detroit, let's get out of here to the southwest.
In tangles with MiGs, the 105s came off well. They had such a reserve of power that if a MiG managed to get in position to fire, they could, in most cases, simply accelerate away from them. Furthermore, the Thuds were capable of turning the tables on their attackers and mixing it up in combat. 28 MiG-17s were downed by 105s. The bombs continued to rain down on Vietnam. Supporting the bombing was an electronics and communications network of unprecedented technical sophistication. Operations controllers directed a huge fleet of varied aircraft at every level, from artillery spotter planes to B-52s. They dispatched rescue operations for downed pilots and coordinated the activities of tankers, bombers, and fighters. Off the coast of North Vietnam prowled the Big Eye planes, packed with sensitive radar and alert for the slightest activity from the MiG squadrons. Any appearance of the MiGs was monitored, and the information relayed to the fighters in the area. The constant observation, coupled with the air superiority of the Phantoms and Thunderchiefs, ensured that for large periods of the war, the Communist Air Force stayed on the ground, pragmatically accepting that they could not compete. The controllers and their equipment directing the airstrikes were part of a chain of command that stretched back from Vietnam through the Pacific headquarters in Hawaii, all the way to Washington, where the targets were identified and authorized. At the very end of the chain were the Thuds, setting off daily with their loads.
He's going to get going in a minute. Okay, I got him here.
Thousands and thousands of sorties succeeded one another, with the F-105 carrying most of the load. Whether or not one questions the strategic effect of the program, it is impossible to deny the burden that the Thunderchiefs carried and the effectiveness with which they pursued their assignments. In June 1967, the first of the Thuds reached the halfway point in their theoretical 4,000-hour fatigue lifetime, with others soon to follow. The most critical fatigue concern was the strain on the engines. The missions the Thuds were flying were unlike anything originally envisaged. They were regularly running at full power, with afterburner for extended periods of time. The stress on the power plants was enormous. The hot sections of the huge J-75 engine were particularly vulnerable to this type of treatment. Already there had been some shortages of spares. As a safeguard, the normal engine life between changes was reduced from 200 to 125 hours, and teams of mechanics worked on overhauling the engines, testing them, and reinstalling them on the planes. By August 1968, the 380th Squadron was flying a Thunderchief with 3,000 hours under its belt, having gone out on 500 missions, received flak damage on several occasions, and been involved in a mid-air collision earlier in the year. By October, 3 more had passed the mark. They were growing old fast. An earlier suggestion to reopen the lines and build more F-105s had been considered, then dropped. There was a replacement for much of their work already available in the Phantom, and construction was proceeding apace on their successor, a design that had been heavily influenced by the story of the Thud, and which reflected many of the lessons learned in its combat life, the F-111. For the time being, the Thuds remained indispensable, and they were constantly tended to in order to maintain their status and prolong their life. The Thuds remained in Vietnam to the end. Not only the two-seater surface-to-air missile-suppressing Wild Weasels, but also the Ds and Fs with their bombs, tactical support, and electronic countermeasures systems. The Thuds were still workhorses right through to the devastating Linebacker 1 and 2 operations, which finally brought the North to to a negotiating position that allowed the U.S. to withdraw from the conflict. Their bombing had sustained the air war against North Vietnam. There was no other plane at the time that could have done the job. The bombing was fiercely pressed home, and the results were devastating, particularly when they were directed against a specific industrial target, as here on this truck maintenance depot. The Ho Chi Minh Trail buzzed with activity during the bombing hauls, with trucks bumper to bumper illustrating 2 points: the wily resolve of the Vietnamese in pursuit of their aims and the effectiveness of the bombing. With thuds overhead, the trucks became far more circumspect. The pilot's tour of duty was 100 missions, and the Thud saw hundreds of pilots through their tours and home again. They were men who were undoubtedly universally glad to be out of the war, glad to have done their job, and grateful to have survived. However, many of them were to miss their big machines and the sensation of howling through the air in a huge metal monster at twice the speed of sound. Captain John Pirwati began growing his mustache when he first arrived in Vietnam in 1967. When he finished his 100th mission, the mustache was 12¼ inches long. On his 55th mission, his Thud was hit by artillery over the Paul Duma Bridge near Hanoi during a bombing run. His story is typical. Not only did he hit the bridge and bring down a span, but the damaged Thud brought him home to finish his tour. Some of the Wild Weasel and other specialist planes stayed with the U.S. Air Force after Vietnam, but the 105s were progressively phased out and retired into the hands of the pilots of the Air Force Reserves. There weren't too many of them around, and they faded rather quickly from use. The last reserve flight of an F-105 was on the 25th of May, 1983, exactly 25 years after the accident on the first flight of the F-105B. Many pilots sat in the seat of an F-105 and went through the startup process. Many owed their lives to them. Most of them considered their plane the best in the inventory. The big fighter grew from its problem childhood, and the parameters of what an aircraft could be asked to do grew with it. In an era of multiple transitions, it is an astounding achievement that so much was gotten right so well in one package. There were never very many of them, and their reputation is perhaps not widespread. But if the words "great plane" can be ascribed to any plane, then they can certainly be ascribed to the F-105 Thunderchief, the Thud.
I was in graduate school in Southern California in 1965-66, and while I was there, I was thinking I'm going to miss out on this war because I had a lot of friends that already had assignments. But I received an assignment at the time before I finished out there for the 105. And the sequence of events was I'd go to survival school at the completion and then to Nellis Air Force Base and check out in the 105 to go to Tak Lee, Thailand.
So when you were at Dallas, how often did you get into Las Vegas?
Surprisingly, I didn't go down there as much as you'd think during that time. We were pretty busy. I went out a few times to make sure I wasn't going to win any extra money.
Tell me as much as you can remember about your journey to Vietnam. How did they get you over there? Did you fly an airplane over there, or did they ship you some other way? Just tell us about going to Vietnam and your first impressions of being there.
Okay. I left from Fort Walton Beach, Eglin Air Force Base in the end of March 1967. I flew commercially to San Francisco and then up to Travis Air Force Base where I was on a military contract flight that island hopped to the Philippines, Clark Air Base, and I went through jungle survival school there for about 10 days. And then I flew again on a contract flight to Bangkok, and then on a military airplane, C-47, the old Goonie bird, up to Tak Lee.
And what do you remember about stepping off an airplane for the first time? And
I had a very memorable introduction. The fellow who was the ops officer for my squadron and the one that became my flight commander subsequently said, "Welcome to the 354th, the highest loss rate squadron in Southeast Asia." Yeah, what a good deal. And about a week later, I went up and met with the wing commander who welcomed the new people. And he told us that in 2 years of operation, the track record was in the 100 missions or 1 year tour, you had a 50-50 chance of being shot down. If you were shot down, you had a 50-50 chance of being rescued. Welcome to the war.
you know, most pilots are in love with the airplane that they flew, but some of those loss rates had to do with the airplane you were flying, correct?
The loss rate, I think, was primarily the mission. But backing up, when I was in graduate school and we knew people were getting assignments, I had volunteered or indicated an interest in every airplane in Southeast Asia except the F-105. And that was based on a briefing from Colonel Yeager when he was head of the test pilot school. He described it as an electronic monster. Can't understand why the Air Force wasted their money on this thing. So I was not particularly happy when I got my assignment. But by the time I checked out in the airplane and started flying it, I started to really like it. By the time I left to go to war, I won't say I was in love with it, but I was proud I was flying it. And the more I flew it, the prouder I was. But our mission, since we only flew in North Vietnam, made us extremely vulnerable. We didn't have much, milk runs. Maybe on a bad weather day, you'd do a recce down in Route Pack 1 north of the DMZ. And that was pretty easy, but I was on my 47th mission, and 31 of them were in the Hanoi area. I'd already beaten the odds 2 or 3 times. I never got to meet Colonel Oles, but he was the commander of the 8th Wing over at Ubon when I was flying, and they flew MigCap on several missions into Hanoi that I was on. But I did not meet him personally until after the war.
So, obviously your missions were into dangerous territory, and I've read that, well, I won't get into reasons, but because of our unwillingness to stop the stuff coming in from the Russians, they had a very robust anti-aircraft defense system. So I imagine every mission was just tremendously high risk.
There were a few missions like when we would do road recce or just general reconnaissance missions down in the lower route packs 1, 2, or 3. That were you almost say were fun. Go out and roam around and see the countryside while you were doing it. But yes, when we went into the Hanoi area, the expression was when you got up there, your ass belongs to Uncle Sam, put those bums on target. And there were some missions that everything's there. We went in, at the time I was there, we'd make run-ins at low altitude around 1,500, 2,000 feet to try to stay out of the radar for the sounds and the radar guns. Therefore, small arms fire was a risk that you had to avoid. But again, in the pattern that we flew, we'd pull up to about 14,000 feet and then come back in on a dive. And that's when the radar could pick you up. Where the first month or so I was there, where the MiGs would be laying for us right over Hanoi. And one mission I was on, we had MiGs going up with us in the pop. We had 105s and MiGs and 105s and MiGs, and SAMs going off and flak all around. I don't know who the MiG leader was that day, but he wasn't too smart. Oh, you could almost watch a gauge drop. I used to laugh. Say, put your hand on the floorboard, you could feel it going by. uh, I'm trying to think. Typical fuel consumption was probably about 3,000 gallons or pounds an hour. The afterburner jumped to a little over 6,000.
So you didn't do that unless you meant it.
No. The best I did, I guess I got it about 1.3 or 4. But that's an interesting story if you want to put on it.
Yeah, go ahead. I'd love to hear it.
We were on a mission on Sunday afternoon in a railroad yard just northeast of Hanoi across the Red River Bridge there. And my flight leader, we were the number 1 bomb flight, and there was a flak suppression flight ahead of us, and the number 4 guy there had been hit and was going down under the clouds. We had about a 2,000 foot level layer. And so my flight leader says, I'm going to follow him down. So that meant me leading the mission out. And about the time I got out and got to recover right across Hanoi, and that's where we were in Afterburner, accelerating out of there and jinking. A SAM went off so close that I flew through the colored cloud, which only lasted a couple of seconds. And I came back and I told him that day, I said, I think the biggest damage I did was going across Hanoi supersonic, blowing out all the windows in town. But as we got out, I was starting to climb out, and a fellow from up here in Georgia who happened to be in my squadron too, I recognized his voice, called me and he says, single 105, 18 east of 97, shake it, you got a MiG on you. So I did a split S right down through the cloud layer, pulled up, and when I did and looked out, there was a mountain ridge on either side of me out here, at least 500 feet higher than me. And I came back out of there rather subdued, to say the least. And I remember I got back and went through debriefing. And intelligence at that time, if you had a tough mission, they'd pull out this bottle of bourbon, old Overholzer, I remember, and they'd give you a shot. And I threw that one down, and I started telling him about the mission. He pulled us, "You like another?" And I said, "Yeah." And I says, "Can I have another one?" I had my 3rd shot of bourbon. We got through the debrief, and I looked at my watch. It was about 5 minutes till the evening church time. And I went down to the chapel, and I knew this Methodist minister was down there, and I leaned up and right up in his face. I said, "It was a close one today, but he got me back here." I said, "You think I'll be okay here?" He says, "He'll be glad you're here. Come on in." But that was probably my most exciting day, other than being shot down.
I guess a day you probably don't enjoy talking about, but I hope you will, July 5th, 1967. And maybe, I'd love for people who, particularly young people, to understand what your day was like. Not just the fact that you were shot down, but your usual day and preparing for a mission. And all you can remember about that day would be wonderful.
I don't have any trouble talking about it. July the 5th, 1967 was obviously a very special day, and 2 or 3 things led up to that, in that I had just been appointed or signed as the executive officer of the squadron, and we were having an inspection. We had a new commander. He asked me to do a check around to make sure we were ready and get acquainted myself. So I had not flown for 3 days. I had sat as spare when they needed, but I didn't get off. And I remember on the night of the 4th of July, I wrote a letter home, and I said, "Well, I missed the fireworks again today, but Fergie promised me tomorrow for sure." And sure enough, I went out on the afternoon mission. I dropped that report off on the commander's desk and headed out. And later on, talking to people in Hanoi when we were together, almost without exception, all of us acknowledged there was something different about the way we felt that day. We couldn't put our finger on it, but it wasn't like a normal day. And I kept trying to think the whole time, what have I forgotten? What did I do or not do or what? And as it turns out, obviously it was that sense, I guess, of the impending, what was imminent. But in my case, I was the number 4 airplane in second flight on a railroad siding right up near the Chinese border. And just as we started our roll-in of the first flight, there was a call for MiGs about 20 miles west of us at our altitude. So as number 4, that's part of my responsibility. So I took a quick look out there to see if I could pick them up. And I didn't see anything, but when I looked back, my leader had already started rolling in, and the flak was so thick that I couldn't see down. So I had to stay up till some bombs went off and I could see the target. Consequently, I had to adjust my roll-in. Instead of being in a 45-degree dive, I was probably at least 60 coming straight down, and I had to adjust the altitude, drop the bombs. And I flew through 3 levels. They were laying out flak at level 3, about 3,000 feet apart. I made it through the three of the levels of flak. But just as my bombs came off, I felt a hit. I'd been hit twice before, so it was unmistakable. But this time, my procedure was when I dropped the bombs, was hit the afterburner, pull out, let that give me the thrust, and start my jinking. Well, when I hit the afterburner, the airplane just did a tumble. And I came back out, it stabilized, and I remember this distinctly. Boy, that'd be a heck of a ride at Coney Island. I'd never been there, but I'd heard about it. So I relaxed, put the burner back in, get out of here, and the airplane just started flipping and tumbling. And I couldn't see out because of the flames, but I was still going to try to make it as close as I could to the water. We'd come in off the Gulf, and we're going back out that way. But about that time, the camera up in front of the dash under the windscreen broke loose, and I had to duck as it went over my head. And as I was looking, the instrument panel just started crumbling, and the airplane was starting to come apart. So I leaned back, put myself in position, pulled the handles, and I remember thinking nothing happened. Boom, it's gone. And I had a very interesting experience in that I grayed out. I couldn't see anything, didn't feel anything. I was just kind of floating. I thought I was dead, literally. And then I started feeling some pressure, and my vision started coming back, and I could see a little bit of green. And then all of a sudden I could see the canopy of, the tops of the trees, and I'm coming down. And I looked up to see if the canopy was open, and it was just starting to blossom. And I reached up to get it, and when I put my hands on the risers, they collapsed. I was sitting on a log on the ground. And that all took less than 2 seconds, because had those automatic systems that got me out, pull to shoot, not worked, I wouldn't be here talking to you today. I figure I went out inverted in negative G's and probably maybe even ejected toward the ground. I don't know. No idea. But somebody up there was looking out for me that day again, like the day that over Hanoi supersonic.
You're not any place you want to be.
Well, the first thing, obviously, that I did once I was on the ground, sitting on the log, my emergency beeper was going off. Get that off so I can talk. But I couldn't get up to it. I couldn't get it cut off. I didn't think. I realized after the fact that I had, because 2 others had been shot down, and their beepers were the ones that were going off, blocking things. But I made an immediate call. Told them I was down safe. I'd check in an hour. That's really optimistic. But sitting on the log looking down was kind of ironic. I looked down and looked at the tree. This is just like North Georgia. Those hills, same kind of scrub trees and pine tree that run around, the ground's gravelly. Then all of a sudden it dawned on me, these ain't going to be friendly North Georgia mountaineers. Everybody I see now may be looking to kill me. So I started trying to get rid of stuff. My chute was caught in the trees. I couldn't get it down. My survival kit that comes out separately had banged down, and I couldn't get it open. But I could get the side open that had the jungle hat with a mosquito net, and a bottle, 2 cans of water. And I pulled out the water, stuck them in my flight suit, put the hat on, threw my helmet down the hill, hoping that would make them think I'd gone that way. And I started up the hill, which was the instructions or recommendations from survival school. And as I got to almost to the top of the hill, and I could see a path out here that I was going to go to, I hesitated just long enough. I think actually my cheese suit got caught in some brambles and kept me from pushing these bushes open. And a Vietnamese ran across closer than 4 feet away. The only thing, he was in a hurry or didn't look my way. So that caused me to look around a little bit and the path. And then I saw these field wires across the way. When I leaned up and looked, I'd come down right in the gun range. There was a gun sight down here about 100 yards and another one over here about 100, 150. And so I reconsidered my actions at this point. Don't get too carried away. But I managed to get across that path without leaving a track with the boots. And I thought if I got over on the other side and down the hill, I could hide out for that hour and check in and maybe get picked up, get out of here. And I didn't realize when I got across, all the brush was over here. I was in grass, maybe a foot, 1.5 feet high. And when I got to the edge and looked down, it was a drop off into a bog. I wasn't going anywhere in that direction. So I sat down and opened one of the cans of water. And at that point, I was so thirsty, I didn't think there was enough water around. I took 2 sips, and I thought it was going to come out my ears, all the psychological, the shock effects. But I managed to drink it, forced it down, threw the can away. And about that time, I heard voices that were gathering up over here along the trail. And they were pointing and talking. And I'd heard some shots and hollering back and forth. They'd obviously found my parachute and helmet. And so they'd eliminated that side. They just really were going to come over here. And they did. And they came out. And I did this and tried to get anything white out of sight and hide down. But it turned out I wasn't going to hide under anything. They walked up and tapped me on the shoulder and welcomed me to North Vietnam. The ones that came out and got me were actually militia. They were in civilian clothes. One of them had a rifle.
I don't mean to interrupt, but these are regular North Vietnamese.
No, these are civilian. They're like militia.
Oh, okay.
They're in civilian clothes. I don't know how they fit into the system right there then, but like I say, one of them had a rifle and they started stripping me down. And of course, when I got my pistol out over here, one of them pulls it out and looks at it. And I don't know why, it was just a sixth sense. I just happened to glance up just as he was starting to come across and hit me in the head, and I ducked and missed him. And the guy with the rifle leaned across and hit him with a butt in his chest to knock him back. And I remember thinking, you and I are going to be friends. I don't know about the others, but I like you. But they packed me down. Well, they started me, took off my boots, stripped out everything out of the flight suit. One amusing thing, I carried a half a pack of Salems because we'd been told that Ho Chi Minh liked those, and if Ho Chi Minh did, most everybody else probably would. And I carried some Winston cigarettes too. They pulled the cigarettes out, looked at them, crumbled them up, and threw them away. And I said, well, so much for intelligence. But they started walking me, and I realized if I walked very far barefooted, my feet were not going to be in a condition to do anything else. So as we started down the trail, I started watching, and I saw a root coming up, and I hooked my foot in it and fell over and convinced them that I'd hurt myself when I got them to carry me all the way down the side of the mountain. And we stopped in a little village. They put me in a house in the back corner on a bed. And I was there, I'd say, between 30 minutes and an hour, and he came in, tapped out, and walked back out. And I got in this, I called it a safari wagon. It was bigger than a Jeep, but not as big as you see safaris nowadays, but open vehicle with a canvas top. And they put me in the back seat, one guy on each side. They're holding my arms like this, so I wasn't tied up. But I looked up, as the fellow on my left in English said, "You're now the prisoner of the Chinese Liberation Army." And what I saw in front was a picture of Mao Zedong and Lin Pao, head of the premier and the head of the People's Army. And I couldn't put my hand up and do the Marine salute, but I said something like, "Okay, you really did it to yourself this time." Because I figured I was gone to China because we were that close to the border. I learned over the next 24 hours that that's why the gun sights were so good down there. The Chinese were running them all. And what we had rolled in over, literally, that got us was what we considered probably the best gun sight in North Vietnam. Of course, now I knew why. And later, in '79, when Deng Xiaoping came to this country, he acknowledged that they had 300,000 regular troops in North Vietnam for the war. So that's what they were doing. And it was also why we had been briefed about 2 or 3 weeks before that there would be no attempted rescues in the buffer zone right up near the border. That they finally acknowledged that those were the Chinese. And I'd have to say that overall, I was well treated with them. They brought me something to eat. They wanted me to do a radio broadcast, which I declined with no pressure. And that night, the commandant came in. They introduced him as the commandant. And through the translator said that if I cooperated with them, that I would be treated well and I'd be taken to Beijing and be treated well. And I declined that kind offer also, because in 1967, Beijing and the moon were about the same distance from Atlanta, Georgia, as far as I was concerned. I did not know, I should say, that we had an F-104 pilot that had been shot down in September of '65 who was already in Beijing. And he came home when we did, and I introduced myself to him and told him my opportunity to meet him. He said, "You made a good choice." He spent 7.5 years in solitaire. And after during the 24 hours with the Chinese, when I knew, they took me around the next day to various gun sites. We'd stop someplace, and about 8 or 10 guys would come out in uniform and line up. And I called him the cheerleader. The head guy would get out his little red book, and he'd read and chant and read, and he'd chant. And the translator then would say, "The U.S. will surely be defeated. The Vietnamese people will surely be victorious." Okay, that's nice. And one thing out of that, which really surprised me, was that almost every one of these guys had a camera. And when the chanting and cheerleading was all over, they'd all gang around there, all making pictures. So I had my fingers crossed that somebody was going to make a picture to get out, because I knew with my close call, I was probably going to be reported as killed in action. So I cooperated with the picture making at that point as much as possible. But that afternoon, they took me up to a place, I guess it was either a subordinate or a corresponding headquarters, where I met some more regular Army. And I had, I guess you'd say, a test of wills. They started the chanting again, and this time they wanted me to say it. And I told them, "No, I'm not going to say that." And one of the guys, I don't know what they smoked, but his eyes showed he had something more than issue, maybe my old Overholzer. But he comes up with his rifle and puts the bayonet right under my chin and pops it up like that, while the translator's right here saying, "You must say it." And I wouldn't shake my head. I just did kind of like that. And after 2 or 3 times like that, and for him saying, "You must say it," I finally just did my lips tightly, a grim, so I'm not going to say that. And an officer obviously came up and got this guy to back off with a rifle. But I wasn't too sure there for a while, because I could see the rifle bore was clean. It was operable. But once that was over, back in the truck, back down to where I'd been before, in an area with a cave. That was my my house right then. And they let me take a nap, and the commander came by and motioned like that, and went out and got in the truck and went down. They turned me over to the North Vietnamese. And I remember when they made that offer and to go to Beijing, I said, no, I want to go to Hanoi. The guy looked at me and just kind of shook his head. So when he turned me over, I leaned back out and I wanted to shake hands with him, and we did, which is part of the story because I hope to meet him later on. But anyway, the Vietnamese blindfolded me, and took me down, I'm pretty confident, to Kemp Airfield. And I got a jet helicopter ride into Gia Lam, right downtown, and then a truck ride across the river to the big prison Wallow. We referred to Wallow as the Hanoi Hilton,
Oh, that's
but
the
also
yeah.
Hanoi Hilton tends to encompass all the camps. If you were in Hanoi, you were in the Hilton, although everybody, with few exceptions, processed through the big prison initially. And I went into New Guy Village there, learned I wasn't nearly as big, mean, and tough and strong as I thought I was. A couple of little fellas with a rope can get you to do and say things that you didn't plan to. And another one that got my arms up behind me for the better part of a day, convinced me to do some things. It had been opened in, I think, summer, June, July area, 66. And they called it the farm because out the edge of town, and you could hear the chickens and the animals and things around, and they named the buildings for things like the barn and the stable and the chicken coop. And it was an old French movie studio, so there was a theater there, that was obvious. They had a swimming pool, and one was a pool hall. So all those names fit in. But one of the guys that was living in front of the pool hall was a real character. One day, well, almost all the doors had these little openings in them. We call them peeps for short. And that's what they'd open up and look, check on you every morning and during the day or at night or whatever. One of the guards came by one day and did that. And after he walked off, this fella tapped to his neighbor next door, says, "The first zoo I've ever been in where the animals look at the people." And from then on, it was the zoo. After the zoo, sometime during the summer of 70, the Vietnamese were readying a new facility for us at an existing army post out again to the west of Hanoi. And they had moved at least two groups in there earlier. One of them from the from the San Tay prison where the raid took place later on. But it was the first time we had compound living, so to speak. It was a big, long barracks that was divided into several rooms. Excuse me. But after a few days, we were all out together. They'd come in, just unlock the doors in the morning. We had to run to the place till siesta time, noonish, when they'd put us back in for a couple hours, and then we'd be back out. We had to run to the place till time to lock up to go to bed. We had a latrine area and a wash shower area. It definitely, it was not Hogan's Heroes, but it was so much better than anything we had had. We're getting sunshine, exercise, and then the San Tay raid popped in, and that was about 6-7 miles away. We heard all the fireworks and see the airplanes and activity, and it scared the bejesus out of the Vietnamese. 2 days later, we were all loaded up, now taken back down to the big prison, Wallow, downtown. And they had opened up an area in the back that we knew was back there because when I was there before, we could hear people back in there. They'd been using it for political prisoners as well as South Vietnamese prisoners they'd captured. And these cell blocks were roughly 25 feet by about 55 or 60. And they had up to 100 to 120 South Vietnamese in each one, and there were 50 to 57 of us in each one. And on the concrete slabs, you had about that much space. And we then had guys laying on bedboards around on the floor. It was a crowded sardine can, but it was so nice to be with people that you'd only heard names of for several years, but now you got a face to go with them, a personality, and you got new people to talk to and new stories to hear. And it was actually fun for a few days. The first stop that I made when we went out to the zoo was in the area that we called the Annex. There was a series of buildings, I think there were 9 or 10 of them, where they stored the film from the studio. And in fact, there were old rolls of film around and so on. And I was in this group of 3 other F-105 pilots that had been shot down in early October. We'd gotten there in late October. But none of us knew anything about the tap code. We'd tried to talk across the wall or do something to the group that was next to us. There were 2 units in each building, but we weren't getting anywhere till the next spring, like March. This Navy lieutenant commander came in who knew the code. He had heard it, but he hadn't had a chance to use it. Wasn't very good at it. But we were over trying to get the guys next door to respond, and they was tapping on the wall, and we were giving names, and they were giving their names back.
I'm sorry to interrupt you, sir, but how did the code work? Was it a form of Morse code, or
No,
how'd you know which letter was what tap?
well, the quick background is one of the very early Air Force officers, I think he was number 6 or 7, shot down, had been talking to a German POW, one of ours who was a German POW in World War II, and talked about this code. And Smitty asked him, what is it? Is it Morse code? No, it's a little matrix, 5 by 5. Excuse me. You drop out the letter K because you can get the same sound using a C. It's A, B, C, D, E, F, G, H, I, J, right on down. And to tap it, you tap, the first tap is for the row, and the second tap's for the column. So a B would be 1, 2, 2. And my initial W, 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, dot, dot. Now, A, dot, dot. And it seems cumbersome till you get it and get going. And once you get established doing it, it's like a lot of other things. You pick up a word from the context and you can get them to go on. And you can do it even faster than the telegraph key, I think. It was a lifesaver for us. But this first effort was really cumbersome. And when they were given their names back, this one came out, as I mentioned, there's no K, you use the C. It came back HICCE, something that doesn't make any sense. So you give him an error and get him to do it again. And about the 3rd time, I don't know why it popped in my mind. I said HIC, and then all of a sudden I remembered saying, ask if that's Jim. And he went back, Jim, and came back, yes, and it's Jim Hickerson. And we had been fraternity brothers down here at Georgia Tech, stood side by side at initiation. He went in the Navy right away when I had that delay at Lockheed, but we'd seen each other about 2 years after both of us had our wings, but that would have been 10 years later right there in Hanoi. But it was after he and I were then moved, as we call it, across the wall into the main prison. He was up in the barn and I was in the pool hall. So we didn't communicate until about 2 years later when we had what I call a fruit basket turnover, and he moved in next door to me and they'd taken some of the bricks out of the windows, and I got to lean in and shake hands with him. But then when we went out to the camp we call Faith at the compound living, and then back into the other, we stayed together for the next 2.5, almost 2 years.
Thinking about the whole experience, you had to go through a range of, I shouldn't say you had to, I would imagine you went through a range of emotions.
Definitely.
In the beginning, you're a new opportunity for them. And then there must reach a point where the enemy says, we've done everything with this guy that's of value to us we can do, and now you just become, I shouldn't say just become, now you're a prisoner. When you think back, I mean, there had to be fear, boredom, hunger. I mean, how do you describe the stages of your imprisonment and what it did to you?
Well, first off was the startling realization that Air Force intelligence at survival school was out of touch with the real world. Because I asked the question as part of the process, what do you know about the POWs? So you're probably aware of the Hanoi March that had happened in the summer of '66. Oh, and by the way, one of the Navy guys was shot down a couple of days before that happened, and they put him in. He got down and got the prison, and his quote was one of the famous ones. He said, "You guys do this very often?" But I was concerned about it, and the sergeant told me in the Philippines, "Oh, we've had reports of really good treatment up there." It says they've been seen out in town at night and in restaurants and theaters and stuff. And I'd been there about a week when I settled down enough, wish I could get my hands on that sergeant again. And also a Marine from Korea. But anyway, I was not prepared for the immediate torture, to be candid. Obviously, in survival school, we were taught name, rank, serial number, date of birth, according to the code of conduct, and evade further question to the best of your ability. But a German POW fellow U.S. Air Force who had been German POW when I was there made the statement that if you have something that they want, they will get it. If you're by yourself, they'll get it out of you. If they're more than one, beware of things they'll do to play you off each other to get it. So once I got the name, rank, serial number, date of birth, and they said, "What was your target?" And I said, "I don't know." And he said, "What do you mean you don't know?" And his English wasn't that good, but I could understand it. But I used the fact that I couldn't to get him to repeat things to buy time to think about what I was doing and saying. But anyway, he let me know right away that name, rank, serial number is not going to cut it. Oh, in fact, that's one of the humorous things. I told you about faking that injury up in the mountain to get them to carry me. I tried the same thing with the Chinese. They brought in a doctor. He checked me out. Said, "No, you're okay." I said, "No, no, you're okay." When I get to Hanoi, now I'm in a new venue. So when the interrogator comes in, he says, "Sit." And he was at a table with this light little gooseneck thing down here with a stool down. He says, "Sit." So I start like I'm going to hobble over there. And he looks up and he says, "Maybe you best actor in survival school, but now you in Hanoi. Sit down." That alerted me. This guy is not a dummy. He's in touch. And over the course of the night, he convinced me that their intelligence was immediately up to date. He asked me 2 questions over the course. One I'd been briefed on it the day before I was shot down, and one the day I was shot down as top secret. And he asked me why this happened. First one was why the 104 or the F-4s no longer fly MiG cap. And I said, "You mean they weren't up there today? I thought they were." And then he says, "Why can you not fly over Hanoi below 10,000 feet now?" And we'd just been briefed on that day because there's a French delegation in town. So once that confirmed that I got to be serious about this. And when he was asking these questions, "What was your target?" I said, "I don't know. I was a spare. I pulled in. I just followed them." Who else was in your flight? "I don't know." "Who's in your squadron?" "Well, I'm new. I've only been there a short time." He kept pressing for names, so I started coming up with guys from high school and from tech who were 4F or never in. I threw in some names of guys that had finished their mission and gone home to be good. And I kept cranking this, and finally, after I don't know how many hours, and several times of tying me up and passing out and coming back to consciousness. He said, "Why you keep lying?" I said, "I'm not lying." They said, "Yeah, you lie. Same day we shoot down man 357 Squadron, tells us everything." And I thought about that a minute, and I said, "Well, if he tells you, why you ask me?" He said, "I want to hear you say." So we're back to the game again. Name, rank, serial number, write down all the same questions. And I remember from survival school, if you're telling a lie and somebody else telling the truth, the liar's in trouble. And I thought, oh gosh, if he really did tell them, I'm in trouble. So I started pulling my answers back to more factual things, but not quite as best I could, but sweating it out. And finally, when he quit about daylight, and this had started a little after dark the night before, and I got the day off, and I lay there, and they brought me some soup and rice to eat, and I got to thinking, he really conned me. He played all those things they told me about in survival school. He did it, and then I bought it hook, line. There ain't nobody else up here now. Yeah. And I never heard any reference about another guy till I got to the zoo with those new 105 pilots. And one of the guys had been at the other base at Karate. And he said, I knew about you. You were shot down the same day as Ward died. And he was a flight leader in another squad. I said, what do you mean? He said, yeah, he and another guy were shot down that day. They were 357th Squadron. So, yeah, they had the guy. They put him out as died in captivity about a week later. And once I got through the fear, and I mentioned the next day when I said he really hooked me, and I got to shape up here and start earning my pay as a major in the United States Air Force. They came in the next morning and says, today you write your autobiography. I said, no, I'm not going to do that. That's Dakota Tonka. You won't write. He said, I ordered you to. I said, I don't take orders from you. None of these guys wore rank, so you didn't know who you were talking to, really, but they all look like kids. As you know, Orientals tend to look much younger than they are for a long, long time. But we went through that, and they said, well, I bring in a camp commander. He orders you to write. I said, okay. So he goes, and I was really being this flippant and blasé, no kidding. So he comes back in a few minutes with a guy about his age, same size. He says, and this is the camp commander. And I said to myself, oh, yeah, this was Saturday morning. I said, oh, yeah, these guys were out drinking beer last night. They said, oh, we're going to have some fun with a new guy. He asked, will you write your autobiography? I said, nope. He talked in Vietnamese. He says, he asked you one last time. I said, no. He talked to me. He says, he orders you to write your autobiography. I said, I take my orders from the Chief of Staff of the United States Air Force. He talked a little more in Vietnamese, and he says, one more time? I shook my head. And the camp commander looks up in very good English and says, you will be very sorry. Got him walked out. 2 or 3 minutes later, this big guy comes in, biggest Vietnamese I saw. And they put me on the ground, pulled my arms back up behind me. I couldn't do it again. My life depended on it. My palms were together behind my neck. I could scratch my neck. And they put Vietnamese handcuffs right there. And they walked out. And I thought, this ain't a big deal. About 5 minutes later, my hands were numb, my arms were numb, and shortly my shoulders were numb, and pretty soon my chest was numb. And so I started walking around so I could keep myself alert and active, I thought. Next thing I knew, I'm laying on the floor. I'd obviously fallen like that. And I did that 3 or 4 times till I just gave up, quit trying to walk around. And during the mealtime, that mealtime came, he comes in with a bowl of soup and a plate of rice and holds it up. And I said, oh, good. We're going to get a break here and get something to eat. He holds it up, sets it on the table, and he does that. And I shook my head. He walked over, picked it up, walked out. Like, maybe they are serious about this. Okay, I'll lay here a while longer. So I guess I passed out off and on, because the next time, the afternoon meal time came, he comes in with the soup and rice again. sets it down to this. And I said, no. But I had been conscious enough during the time that I realized I hadn't seen another American. I've been here for 4 days now. And this was the funny part. I haven't felt my hands all day. This is into the afternoon. I haven't felt anything from my waist up in a good while. If I can't use my hands, I can't feed myself. And I probably can't play golf again. So when he starts to pick up the stuff to go away, I said, wait a minute. And he turned around, does that, and I said, I'll try. He picks it up. And I said, okay. He turned around and nodded my head. He wouldn't leave till I said yes. So he left the suit, went out and got the officer, came back, and the officer asked me, and I tried with him, I'll try. And he shook his head. So I said, okay. So he takes the handcuffs off, and I'd been through rope tying up before, and when they do that, the whole purpose is to cut off circulation, and when they release it, it's like grabbing an electric wire. If you've ever been shocked, you know, by a house curl. Well, this time when it came off, I just shook all over. And they brought in a little booklet, like I never had it down here, but they call it test booklets, you know, the little blue book sort of thing lined with a whole thing of questions. Sit down and write. And so for about 3 or 4 days, I'd sit there and hold a pen in my mouth and push it around with my hands. And I'd get 6 or 8 words on a page that way and use up stuff. And it was questions, what's your name? I put it down. What's your father's name? I put daddy. What's your mother's name? I put mommy. Where were you born? I put early age. You know, just Mickey Mouse. See, I don't know. I guess I was so beaten down by this point I didn't really care what it did. I was going to have some fun in the process. But they never referred to that again. And it proved, for me at least, the whole point was, we can make you do it. What that sergeant had said. We'll show you that we run this camp. You'll do what we tell you to do. So from then on, as a game of how much I could keep them from doing. And then that night, when you were asking, this was really my low point. When I ate that meal and realized that I had been broken. And so we had a big thunderstorm. It rained, and I was so thirsty. They hadn't given me any water except when an interrogator would be there, and he'd have a cup and offer it. And I remember I got up and I pulled the table over, put the chair on it, put the stool on it, and got up where I could get this vent, and reached out and got a hold of a limb on the tree so that the rain coming down and run down, and I'd get some water off my arm. And then it quit raining about the time I got it. And so I went over and leaned up against a wall, just slumped down, and there was one light way over in the corner. And I looked up, and it just kept attracting my attention. And I remember thinking it was like Moses in the burning bush, I guess. And I sat there and I looked at the light. And whether it was a split second or an hour, I can't tell you. But I had an experience of something happened to me, and it was all over. I feel very comfortable, very secure. You're going to live, you're going to get out of this, and you'll go home someday. And from then on, I was able to accept things that happened, and when there would be a crackdown right after escape in a night camp, and other things that would come down, you'd have a little sense that this might be bad. I could just think about it for a minute, and I could feel comfortable again and go on and do what I had to do. And I remember thinking Harry Truman made the statement as president that he had no trouble sleeping every night because he knew he had done the best that day that he knew to do, and he needed his rest for the next day. And I realized that I was able to do that. I could lie down every night and go to sleep no matter what was going on.
And how long had you been a prisoner when that happened?
I was shot down on Wednesday afternoon, and that was Saturday night.
So
3 days.
3 days after you were shot down, you feel you had a moment that gave you, I won't call it peace, but gave you something that got you through the rest of those years.
Yep.
Was there a day in that prison camp after that that you didn't feel that awareness or didn't think about that? Or did that sustain you every single day?
I can't say that I thought it consciously every day, but the feeling was there every day.
And what do you think about that now? What do you think that was?
It still sustains me. And the experience that I had there after we were in those large groups, we started, after some confrontations with the Vietnamese, we started having Sunday church services. And I thought about it a lot. You know, what does this mean to me? What do I do? And I participated, not as an activist, but participated in the services, attended. And when I got home, I went to see another one of our classmates down here at Georgia Tech who had become an Episcopal minister. And I talked to him about it and asked him, you know, how did you make the transition? Because he had been a technical major. How did you make the transition to the him experience? And the first assignment I had when I got back was at the Air War College. And one of my classmates there was a Catholic priest that I got to know fairly well. And I was still in this time, you know, I was saved in that ejection. I went through this other experience. What am I here for? And the Catholic priest helped me put it in the best perspective. He said, don't try to solve the problem. He said, you go through your life looking for the sign or looking for this or what. He said, you may miss what you're actually here for. He said, just accept the fact that you're here and make the most of it that you can. And that's really what's been with me ever since.
Not like 5.5, almost 6 years a prisoner. How did you find out you were going home and when you were going home? And tell me about that experience.
Well, to put it all in perspective, when Nixon started the bombing again in May of '72, we were in the big prison there at Wallow. And somebody that went to quiz, as we called the interrogations, because it was easier to say and to tap, brought back a message that Nixon is a crazy man. We don't know what happens now. But we had in our camp 1 South Vietnamese prisoner and 3 Thai prisoners who were allowed out to work and do things. And of course, they were speaking the language, and they were really our intelligence. And we got a heads up that 209 was the number, literally, were going to be moved out of camp. And sure enough, about a week later, 209 of us were moved right up to the Chinese border, deep in the mountains, and a camp that we thought initially was new to us. We learned later on that others had been there ahead of us, who I don't know. But we spent the rest of '72 there and over the winter. And in October, we didn't have radios in each cell there. They didn't have power like we had back in the big prison. We had these little radios in each room, and you got these propaganda broadcasts. Hanoi Hana, we called it, the voice of Vietnam, all the garbage. Up here, they had to do it by quizzes. And one of the fellows that went early picked up, they were asking him, what do you think about this proposed end of the war, or whatever? This is in early October. And then I was called out right at the end of October. And he asked me, he said, are you disappointed there was no settlement in October? I said, no, I didn't know there was going to be one. So how can I be disappointed for something I didn't know wasn't going to happen anyway? And kind of went on with that. And then over Christmas and the holiday and New Year's, it got really cold and we were settling in. All of us were looking to be there in the winter. And one night, the building I was in up the top of the hill, one of the fellows woke us up. They said, we just had 3 trucks come into camp. So we all stayed up and we counted 17 trucks. You don't need that many to bring in a month's load of food. Something is up. And the guards came around that morning and let us out to go out to eat or to shave, whatever we're going to do. We had a little area, kind of a little patio we could get out to in our building. And he looks around at one of the other guys and he does this. And then he goes back like that. Look, something is really up here. So we went back in, and just so we didn't miss out on it, we all started rolling up our gear. That afternoon, when the guard came around and opened it up, and he gives us this, which was the signal to roll up, ready to move, we just all leaned over, patted our roll. He got a big smile on his face, and right after dark, they loaded us on the trucks, headed back to Hanoi, and about halfway down mid-afternoon, we stopped and had a little coffee break. They gave us water and little energy bars, coconut bar stuff. And instead of getting back on the truck necessarily to your own, they divided us out in 4 categories. And what turned out to be the first 2 release groups went back to the big prison. The 3rd release group went to the one we called a plantation, and the 4th one went to the zoo. And, excuse me, we'd been back about a week, and I was at the plantation in the 3rd group. They called us out one afternoon. We lined up, and the camp commander came over, and he read us the protocol from the Paris Treaty that in itself required that the prisoners be notified within 48 hours of this date. And they were told it, and they stood there for a few minutes waiting for us to do something, and when we didn't, they said, okay, dismissed, and we all filed back into our own little cells, and then we went up hugging each other. So, God, I hope it's true, hope it's true. And in my particular case, I was pulled out and taken up to Wallow. It turns out that after the first release group, there was a little difference of opinion between, and the conditions for release were that everybody would be released in 4 equal increments over the next 60 days. So, and with the sick and wounded being released first. Well, the U.S. expected that to be release the sick and wounded, then 4 more increments. The Vietnamese interpreted it to be the sick and wounded would be in the first increment. So they had a little hassle about that. And somehow they came up and released 20 guys, just pulled almost at random, came out. So as that was going on, I was pulled up to the 2nd release group. Then they decided, no, the count didn't work. So I went back to the plantation. And then they pulled me out again. And whatever the problem was, we were supposed to be released on the 1st of March. And the camp commander came in, and we had the big, going away thing, special dinner, blah, 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 on the last night in February. And then he told us, he said, maybe you do not go tomorrow. There is a small problem. I will let you know. So the next morning he comes in and said, I don't think so today. And that night he said, maybe tomorrow. And then by March the 3rd, we were said, oh, to hell with it. I hope somebody got out of here anyway. And he came in that night and he says, I think tomorrow, okay. And sure enough, the next morning he comes in and came in. There was a group called, I forget the exact name, but there were an Indian, a Canadian, a Czech, and another Soviet Union type had to come around and inspect everybody. So they came through. We figured, I think we might make it today. And sure enough, about an hour later, we started going out. We got our go-home clothes that we'd been fitted for. We went out to pick them up, put them on. And they walked us out the front gate, and they had their little 20-seat buses out there, and we all got on and headed over to Jialam for the big trip home.
I'd like to hear this.
Well, we got out there, as we pulled out onto the ramp, and I saw that 141 out there. Of course, working out there, my neighbor at Craig had gotten out of the Air Force and was test pilot in 141, and I'd walked out into one just before I left to go to Southeast Asia. And I saw that airplane, the United States of America, and that big flag up there. And I told a lot of people, when I walked down and walked up that ramp, I could smell the red clay out of North Georgia. I knew I was going home.
Is that just an expression, or did you really feel like you smelled?
I started feeling like I'm headed home, yeah.
Well, the one question I want to ask you, the penultimate next to the last, is a lot of things changed for you while you were a prisoner. You found out about losing your father and losing other family members and your wife. And again, if you don't mind my asking, what sustained you through that?
Well, I had premonitions or indications, I guess you'd say, on both. I only got 2 letters from my wife, and there were 6 lines, but she only used about 4 of them. So all she just said was, the children are fine, they help a lot. Another one was, I moved to Atlanta to go to Emory, the children doing well. You could almost read into it the indifference. And in the case of my dad, the one thing that I got from my mother was a birthday card that was signed Love, Mother. And that was probably one of the really low points when I realized he was gone, because I was looking forward to seeing him. I knew he was in bad shape when I left, but I was looking forward to going back and seeing him again. And so when I got there to Clark, we'd been there, I don't know, 3 or 4 hours, and they came around and got me and said, there's a colonel up here who wants to see you. And he introduced himself from 13th Air Force Headquarters. And we were standing in the doorway to the little ward area that I was in, and I looked up, and a technician that had been seeing me around was leaned up to the desk up here about 20, 30 feet. And I don't know why I turned around. There was another technician back standing around over here. This is not going to be a standard conversation. What is it? So he started out casually, told me about my aunt dying and my uncle dying and my father-in-law dying, and then your father died, and then your wife got a divorce. And as I've described it, it wasn't a surprise. It was the shock of confirmation. The things I was hoping weren't true, but I had a sense. And it was kind of ironic when I learned about more detail about my wife's divorce. When I was up in the mountains and I hadn't gotten anything, heard anything, I went to a quiz and I asked an officer whom I'd known from way back at the zoo. I said, I hadn't heard anything from my wife in a long time. I said, I'm wondering if maybe something's happened. He said, no, I think everything's fine. And I said, well, I would really like to know. I don't want my children to be hurting or having any problem. He said, okay, I ask. And several months later, I went to quiz with him again, and he said, I asked. He said, I think everything okay. As it turns out, that first quiz was within a week of when she filed for the divorce, and the second one was within a week of when it was granted. And they had sent the paperwork to Hanoi to camp a detention, and since I didn't reply within 30 days, I wasn't contesting it. Well, I was still going through the checkout down at Maxwell Air Force Base in Montgomery, Alabama, but my mother wanted to get the family together at home and visit. And so I flew up commercially, and my ex-wife was here in town at the time. She came out and picked me up at the airport, and we went over to her house, and we were talking. I was going to take my children out with me for this party, and we were sitting there talking, and she said, how you plan on getting to Bremen? Oh, gosh. That hadn't crossed my mind. Oh, well, I'll rent a car. Oh, no, I guess I can't do that. I don't have a driver's license. Why? I didn't think of riding the bus. I don't know, because that'd been right off the bat. I thought, well, maybe Pat will rent me an airplane, because I had a pilot's license, commercial license. And I wasn't thinking of the fact that you got to have a medical to make it effective. But she said, well, you better do something. So this is getting kind of late if you're going out there tomorrow. So I called him up. I don't know, I guess we were looking at the phone book. I got him at home. And I said, hey, you got any airplane you might rent out tomorrow? He says, what for? I said, well, I need to get out to Bremen with me and the children. He said, when you want to go? And I said, oh, sometime mid-morning or so. He says, hold on a minute. Looked around, he said, how's about 10 o'clock? Would that be good? 10:30? I said, yeah, it'd be fine. So he said, well, you know how to get out to my place? And I said, yeah. He said, all right, I'll see you then. So we come driving up out here, and it turns out he had a demonstration set up for a hoped-for sale with a King Air, I think it was. Anyways, about an 8 or 10 place airplane. And this company, people were here, and they were really nice, welcoming us in. And said, yeah, we'll be glad. And they gave me a ride out to West Georgia Airport, and my brother was there to pick me up. But Pat and I have laughed about that a lot of times.
Those 6 years of your life that you literally gave to this country, and all that happened to you, what would you say to young people? Or what would you, if you could get them all to pay attention to you for the next minute, what would you say?
Well, first I would say that I'm proud of my service. At the time I was there, I honestly believed that we were doing something that needed to be done, because the threat of communism and the expansion of China and their efforts to, particularly in Asia and in Southeast Asia, could have had very difficult future. And while we did not win, and unfortunately I think I have to say we actually did win the combat. Our politicians gave it away later on. But we did accomplish a stalemate, so to speak, and I think we stopped that expansion, gave those countries a chance to get on a little firmer basis. As far as Vietnamese people, I was disappointed for them, the boat people, that many were killed or died in the process of getting out of there, and in Cambodia that were literally killed during the Pol Pot regime. I don't think we can take any pride at all in allowing that to happen. But when we finally started recognizing the Vietnamese, I was asked by one of the local stations, what do you think about it with the trade and then the recognition? And I said, well, we're going over there to give them a chance for self-determination, and it looks like they're finally going to get it. And on the 2 trips I've made back over there, I think we really did win the hearts and minds, because they really like Americans there now. But for the status now and the condition and the future of this country, I have real concern. The last few years, the mood of the country, the culture of the country, society have changed in ways that I cannot say that I feel proud about. But I do talk to enough young people who have good attitudes and good patriotic values that I'm optimistic that they will rise to the top and be the cream of the crop, and we'll get this country back on track someday.
In December 1951, after Lockheed Corporation aircraft designer Clarence Kelly Johnson returned from meetings with U.S. Air Force pilots fighting over Korea,
he was committed to developing the world's fastest and highest-flying fighter. The specifications for the Lockheed Starfighter were finalized in 1952, and it took its inaugural flight in 1954. The last F-104 to be produced rolled off the assembly line in 1983. In the early 1950s, with the Korean War imposing new demands on U.S. aircraft, designers were faced with a challenge regarding the available engines. A new era of engine technology was in its infancy, with development still at very preliminary stages and timelines for availability uncertain. Consequently, the designers faced a dilemma whether to proceed with the currently available but somewhat limited power plants or to await the potentially lighter and more powerful engines still in development. At Lockheed, under the leadership of Kelly Johnson, renowned for heading one of the world's premier design teams, the approach oscillated between lightweight concepts utilizing existing jet technology and significantly heavier, more potent designs based on anticipated advancements in engine capabilities. Johnson's association with Lockheed began during the Electra's development, where he supervised certain wind tunnel tests at the University of Michigan. His keen insights and constructive critiques of the new aircraft drew the attention of Lockheed engineers. He was hired by the company, and it was his work on developing the Electra and the subsequent Hudson bomber into success stories that gave him a rapid rise. His innovative and intuitive work brought great rewards for the company. The P-38, with its unorthodox long-range capabilities and enjoyable flying experience, exemplified his unconventional approach to design solutions. It proved both a successful aircraft and a profitable venture, manufactured in significant quantities. The distinctive twin booms of Lightning symbolize the pace and daring of aviation development in the 1930s. However, with the conclusion of the war, activity slowed considerably, particularly in military aviation, with the most attention focused on new jet engines and civil aviation, albeit with limited funding. Contrary to the post-war trend in many countries, the USSR continued to advance rapidly in fighter plane design. A plethora of new designs emerged, although some proved inadequate initially. Eventually, Russia began producing highly impressive military aircraft in large quantities. The prevailing Western perception that Russians lagged behind in design and industrial competence was shattered when MiG-15s appeared in the skies over Korea, surprising many with their advanced capabilities. Under pressure to contend with the MiGs and their sabers, U.S. pilots clamored for revolutionary aircraft to regain the advantage they had previously taken for granted. After numerous visits to Korea, Kelly Johnson heard firsthand from pilots who urgently demanded a new plane surpassing the Russians in altitude and speed, and they needed it promptly. This directive settled the debate on Lockheed's next project. Recognizing the necessity for a high-altitude, high-speed aircraft, Johnson envisioned a lightweight fighter. Rapidly, he focused on what would become the F-104's most contentious design feature, its remarkably small and thin wing. This departure from conventional design principles, including the abandonment of highly swept shapes favored for supersonic flight, marked a significant departure from prevailing thought. Extensive wind tunnel testing ensued, exploring countless variations around the core concept. Much of this testing concentrated on validating the wing, as numerous doubts were raised about its viability. Skeptics questioned whether the wing could fly at all, whether it could withstand the stresses of high-speed flight, and whether it could carry any meaningful payload, even if it could cope with the speed. It was to be only 7 feet long and to go from being just over 4 inches thick at the fuselage down to under 2 inches thick at the tip. Innovative boundary layer control techniques were implemented to generate sufficient lift within a compact area, enabling short landing distances, albeit without internal provisions for guns or wheels. Numerous aspects of a design underwent rigorous examination in supersonic wind tunnel tests. Of particular focus were the air intakes, where efforts were concentrated on demonstrating that shock waves around the inlets facilitated a controllable and reliable supply to the engines. Recorded footage captured shock waves around the muddle during tests conducted near Mach 2, aimed at determining pressure loads of the ducting under various flight conditions. In addition to wind tunnel testing, the F-104's design was subjected to unconventional trials, involving models mounted on 5-inch Army rockets and was launched across desert terrain. These tests effectively simulated the stress of high speeds and accelerations experienced at lower altitudes, providing insight into both wing shape and construction techniques. Despite their unconventional nature, these rocket firings proved invaluable for the engineering team, facilitating assessments of wing performance and construction under extreme conditions. Similar tests were conducted on the tail, which, like the wing, was designed to be exceptionally thin, prompting skepticism regarding its strength. Once again, these tests proved instrumental in optimizing the design. Within a brief development period, hundreds of models were constructed and tested, allowing for continuous refinement of the aircraft's key components. Generally little or nothing was added to the original plane, and with the F-104's appearance settled, a contract was issued for 2 planes to be built. The fabrication process commenced with the construction of 3 fuselage modules at full scale, while simultaneously, jigs were assembled to support the entire aircraft structure. Throughout the workshop, activities such as drilling, milling, and cutting of parts began in earnest. The aircraft, produced on an experimental production run, were essentially crafted by hand. Following the receipt of the March 1953 contract, Lockheed swiftly cleared production space, erected a wooden mock-up, and seamlessly transitioned to building the 2 prototypes without interruption. Remarkably, the first flight was scheduled to occur just 12 months after the contract was signed. The achievement within this short time frame was truly astonishing. Unlike designs that had been in development for an extended period, this aircraft came into existence in late 1952, representing a significant leap forward in aviation technology. Despite its advanced nature, its development proceeded at an extraordinary pace. The unconventional wing design, bolted to the fuselage rather than passing through it as with most contemporary fighters, was secured on with heavy-duty precision-forged aluminum fittings, integrating seamlessly within the wing's skins. Johnson's design, though straightforward in some respects, resulted in an aircraft that could soar higher and faster than the MiGs, effectively creating a manned missile. Even the retractable undercarriage, which folded into the fuselage in a fairly complex manner, underwent meticulous testing beyond the norm. The Air Force had no legal document calling for submission of a design anything like the 104, and without the prestige of Lockheed and Kelly Johnson, they may have simply rejected it. Despite the bold claims of anticipated performance, the concept was deemed both logical and exhilarating, leaving no alternative but to proceed with the issuance of the March 1953 contract. While there was no apparent existing slot in inventory for such an aircraft, the lessons learned from the Korean War suggested a compelling argument for its necessity. Nevertheless, the F-104 remained firmly under scrutiny, subject to rigorous evaluation. Construction of the aircraft progressed swiftly, with major subassemblies swiftly coming together, followed by vibration testing conducted at Lockheed's facilities. This testing aimed to establish the natural frequency patterns of entire structure, ensuring its safety for flight. Under tight security, the F-104 prototype departed the Lockheed plant on early morning of February 25, 1954, bound for Edwards Air Force Base. Upon arrival, crews immediately commenced a thorough series of checks and rechecks on the aircraft systems and meticulous preparation for its maiden flight. The engine selected for the prototypes was the Wright J65, which was to prove very inadequate in propelling the 104, Deedon light though it was. The majority of production starfighters were equipped with a General Electric J79 engine, renowned for its higher thrust-to-weight ratio, poised to propel the F-104 beyond twice the speed of sound. As the first flight approached, the rigorous pace of testing persisted, with the engine undergoing thorough run-ups and final preparations. Despite a minor incident during taxi trials on February 28th, when test pilot Tony Levier experienced a brief skip, the F-104 was officially rolled out for its inaugural flight on March 4, 1954. Levier conducted a series of ground tests, ensuring the proper operation of flight controls and systems before confidently taking off for the first time. In the ensuing weeks of test flights, it became apparent that the power plant was unable to fully unleash the Mach 2 potential of the airframe. Nevertheless, the concept of a lightweight fighter was unequivocally validated. Despite the prototype's inability to surpass 1.3 times the speed of sound with its existing engine, the design was deemed successful enough for the Air Force to order 15 additional planes with upgraded power plants, designated as F-104A models. In April 1955, one of these finally took the starfighter past Mach 2, which was the signal for F-104 production to swing into top gear. For the moment, the intense testing of the two prototypes continued. Both prototypes, depicted here flying in tandem, met tragic ends during the prolonged and troubled test period. Numerous incidents occurred, revealing flaws in the aircraft's engine and equipment, often occurring in situations of significant or imminent danger. In one such early mishap in 1955, Tony Levier encountered trouble while testing the firing of the starfighter's high-speed cannon during supersonic flight. Following an initially successful firing, Levier prepared for another run to test the gun once more. However, during this attempt, a catastrophic failure occurred, resulting in a complete loss of engine power. With quick thinking, Levier, approximately 40 miles from base, assessed his options. Despite being theoretically high enough to glide back to land, he knew that he had to act swiftly. He approached the lower limits for safe ejection from the aircraft. Before even opening match, a telltale smudge of smoke on the fuselage indicated that the gun had caused the issue. Inspection revealed a hole in the gun compartment caused by a cartridge ejecting backward to the gun baseplate. Relieved to find the malfunction confined to the gun rather than the airframe, engineers promptly rectified the issue, allowing testing to resume. The starfighter's gun was the Vulcan M61 cannon. 6 feet long and 300 pounds in weight, it was, at that time, claimed to be the fastest firing gun of its type in the world. The M61 cannon boasted an impressive firing rate of 6,020 mm cannon shells per minute. Drawing inspiration from the renowned Gatling gun, patented as far back as 1862, the M61 incorporated two key features: a rotating cluster of barrels and external propulsion. By rigidly clamping 6 barrels together, the design provided mutual support, minimalizing the whip effect seen in single-barrel configurations and centralizing recoil. Unlike the hand-cranked Gatling guns of the Civil War era, the M61 was powered electrically by the aircraft, eliminating the need to capture and utilize gun exhaust. This innovation reduced susceptibility to corrosion and fouling, each round fired independently, negating the erratic recoil associated with multi-gun and gas-reloaded systems. Considering the challenges encountered in the early days of integrating the M61 with the F-104, it's important to view these issues as part of the expected learning curve with any advanced equipment. Comparing the M61 Vulcan to the U.S. Air Force's previous preference for machine guns presents difficulties in terms of hitting power, firing rate, and the influence of aircraft dynamics on the gun's operation and overall effectiveness. The Vulcan outstripped previous options to such a degree that meaningful evaluation becomes irrelevant, even with consideration of multiple machine gun installations. In contrast to Kelly Johnson's initial assessment, the military procurement policies of the era demanded multi-role capability. Consequently, despite the F-104's origins as a specialized single-function fighter, provisions were developed to allow it to carry a variety of weapons. While the Starfighter's exceptional performance was acknowledged by the USAF, it wasn't deemed sufficient justification for the project. Lockheed was compelled to explore unconventional attachments for the aircraft in an attempt to persuade the Air Force to continue with the program. One such innovation was the trapeze installation designed to facilitate the carriage and delivery of the Genie nuclear rocket. This ingenious launching mechanism was another manifestation of Kelly Johnson's intuition. When faced with the challenge of ensuring the aircraft could deliver the device over a combat radius of 650 miles, Johnson committed to achieving this within a mere 60 days. Given the already limited space within the Starfighter's fuselage, one of the primary considerations in designing the launcher was ensuring it didn't interfere with the undercarriage. Despite these challenges, the F-104 successfully demonstrated firings of the Genie at altitudes of 56,000 feet and speeds exceeding 1.7 times the speed of sound. However, the aircraft's ability to meet such challenges ultimately did little to sway the Air Force's eventual assessment. Lockheed conducted tests with various weapons delivery attachments and external fuel tanks, aiming to enhance the plane's range and versatility. Despite these efforts, the project faced mounting opposition, and the weight of opinion against it continued to grow. The 104 was very much in the right place at the wrong time. The F-104 Starfighter defied the prevailing trends in the aircraft design of its time. While other fighters were growing in size to accommodate more functionalities, Kelly Johnson opted to strip down the aircraft to its essential components, aiming to achieve Mach 2 speeds with a single afterburning turbojet engine. However, this approach ultimately limited the Starfighter's career with the USAF. There simply wasn't enough space within the aircraft to accommodate the rapidly expanding hardware requirements of radars, aiming controls, and other advanced avionics systems. Despite its unmatched capabilities, which surpassed those of its heavier counterparts, the Starfighter's versatility was often overlooked amidst the general disdain towards lightweight fighters. Criticisms focused on its lack of all-weather capability, lifting power, and range, ultimately leading to the discussion to phase it out of service. The project was set for financial failure, but the work that had started on giving the F-104 greater versatility went on apace, trying to forestall the inevitable and keep the Air Force involved in the plane. The F-104 starfighter boasted a formidable weapons capability, including standard systems such as the Sidewinder air-to-air Bismarck. It was widely acknowledged as an effective firing platform, excelling in its designated role to air superiority and proving itself to be lethally efficient, akin to a stiletto. From the outset, the Air Force maintained a cautious stance towards the F-104. It was the first aircraft to be procured on a fixed then fly basis. Prior to this, the Air Force had typically accepted new aircraft into service while they were still undergoing testing, adhering to the flying and then fixed principle. However, given the radical nature of the F-104, the responsibility for testing and rectifying issues was shifted back to the manufacturer, a practice that has since become standard due to the complexity of modern combat aircraft. As the likelihood of significant USAF orders diminished, a new market quietly emerged in Europe. The remarkable performance of the F-104, coupled with its rapidly expanding tactical capabilities, solidified its reputation as the benchmark design in its class. Despite initial reservations, the F-104's prowess ensured its continued relevance and appeal on its international stage. On top of the expansion and weaponry of the plane, during 1958 and 1959, it was set on a spree of record-setting to reinforce the message of its potency. Even when the new F-4 Phantom II broke some of the Starfighter's records, the F-104 promptly set new marks outside the F-4's ability. In order to address criticism regarding its limited range, the F-104 Starfighter incorporated in-flight refueling technology, a relatively new concept at the time. Considerable effort and resources were invested in integrating this capability into the aircraft. The F-104 had to demonstrate capabilities in ordnance, range, and technical sophistication, features that were initially excluded from the designer's original considerations, but were now essential to meet the potential specifications set by the Western and Luftwaffe. To secure large-scale sales, the aircraft had to overcome the same challenges set by the USAF. It needed to evolve into a multi-role, all-weather strike aircraft and excel in the tasks assigned to it, including seemingly straightforward tasks such as aerial refueling. The German order became increasingly significant, necessitating various unexpected capabilities from the aircraft, such as an enhanced barrier landing strength. The Luftwaffe sought the ability to deploy aircraft away from bases in times of conflict. While the F-104 demonstrated the necessary strength to handle artificially shortened landings, the challenge for the pilots in executing these maneuvers was considerable and posed additional hurdles. In the long term, there were to be few performance targets set for the F-104 that it could not cope with. There was always an uncertainty regarding whether the individual pilots would be able to handle the F-104 effectively. The necessity for specific training of the pilots for the F-104 signaled a shift in aviation training practices, foreshadowing trends that would become more prevalent in the future. While a properly trained pilot flying a well-maintained F-104 was not at risk, the combination of an unprepared pilot and the aircraft could prove to be lethal. The survival of the starfighter became contingent upon sales in the overseas markets, with the development of the aircraft driven by the specified and perceived needs of NATO clients. For example, if Germany required short takeoff and landing capabilities, Lockheed would showcase successful crash barrier landings and zero-length launch capabilities. In one instance, the truck-mounted rocket-propelled launch system was demonstrated with an F-84. Both unmanned and pilot launches were executed satisfactorily. Although this development didn't yield any immediate practical applications, the potential for successful employment with the starfighter was seen as a valuable asset to the project in the eyes of the Luftwaffe. With West Germany being the border between Eastern and Western spheres of influence, it was essential that no less than the other European states she retrieve her power as a military force, not only in weaponry, but in industrial capacity. Unlike the aftermath of the First World War, there was a perceived need for a strong Germany within the Western Alliance, and Germany's concerns became pivotal considerations for the strategists at Lockheed working on selling the F-104. Given NATO's need for new weaponry and the desire to standardize armaments across a number of countries, focusing on Germany's potential requirements was a logical approach. If Lockheed could fulfill Germany's call for new equipment, it was anticipated that many others would follow suit. Although the F-104 never saw regular use of rocket-assisted takeoffs, 104Ns were utilized for exposing potential astronauts to hydrogen peroxide thrust controls at altitudes exceeding 100,000 feet. One of the developments that revitalized the F-104's concept was the introduction of the two-seat variant. It was customary for U.S. fighters to have a trainer or reconnaissance version with 2 seats, and the F-104 followed suit. While the Germans primarily sought a ground strike aircraft, they also desired a versatile platform, prompting serious consideration of a twin-seat variant. As part of Lockheed's sales strategy, a production offset package was proposed, involving the manufacturing of planes by consortia of European aviation companies. This approach aimed to not only secure sales but also foster collaboration and investment within European aerospace industries. The shot in arm for European aerospace capability from the construction of these new factories was one of the declining factors in the successful campaign. The plane itself performed very well. In the fly-offs, the F-104's superiority over the other contenders was evident, almost to the point of being a walkover. The competition for the contract was fierce, with some highly capable aircraft, notably the British Lightning, among the contenders. However, political considerations seemed to have played a role, and by the time the contract was awarded, the F-104 had demonstrated itself as the standout performer. Despite its unquestionable performance, the F-104's reputation as a high-performance aircraft had its drawbacks. Its demanding nature meant that it could be unforgiving to inexperienced or careless pilots. There were strict limits on what a pilot could push the F-104 to do. Over the course of the development period, which was plagued by various challenges, over 8,000 flights were conducted in the test series using 52 aircraft. Unfortunately, several aircraft were lost due to equipment malfunctions and pilot errors. The F-104 represented a convergence of two eras in aviation technology, with much of the technology being new and untried. This juxtaposition is illustrated humorously by the sight of the F-104's streamlined nose attached to the front of a DC-3 during avionics testing. While the F-104 was not the first U.S. designated aircraft to prioritize lightweight and compact design, its development marked a significant step forward in this regard. For instance, the Bell XP-77 had nearly entered production during the Second World War, demonstrating a similar focus on lightweight design principles. Their win, too, was not without precedent, being very similar to that of the X-3. The F-104 starfighter was undeniably revolutionary in many aspects. Yet, as the program progressed, it became mired in controversy, much of which extended beyond issues with the airframe itself. This controversy led to the unfair dismissal of the starfighter as a lemon. The USAF withdrew its F-104s from operational service after just 2 years, although some were later deployed during the Vietnam War, primarily serving as high-flying escorts for B-52s and IMBA-level tactical support strikes. Meanwhile, the USSR, having learned valuable lessons from the Korean War, developed a MiG-17 in response to changing combat requirements. Unlike the F-104, which prioritized speed and climb performance, the MiG-17 was designed as a short-range interception fighter with high-speed capabilities, rapid climb rates, and agile maneuverability. Equipped with air-to-air missiles, internal cannon, and a light ground support bomb load, the MiG-17 was essentially an updated version of the MiG-15, featuring improved handling and more swept-wing design. Despite being considered theoretically obsolete upon its proposal, the MiG-17 proved to be a highly effective aircraft. U.S. thinking was totally different. If we ignore the F-104 and look at the other Sentry fighters, we find that they were all much larger planes. They also shared a commitment to state-of-the-art technology with varying degrees of success. The F-100 Super Sabre, F-101 Voodoo, F-102-106 Delta Dagger Delta Dart also limited service in Vietnam and eventually faded into history. Each of these aircraft, in its own way, epitomized the concept of the fighter as a standoff missile launch platform. Initially conceived as specialized aircraft for specific roles within the fighter spectrum, such distinctions blurred over time as each aircraft evolved to possess multi-role capabilities. The F-100 and F-101, in particular, diversified into different roles as their careers progressed. Among the Sentry series aircraft, it is doubtful that any could have effectively countered the F-104 starfighter. Even many more modern aircraft would have struggled against the F-104's capabilities. The overseas sales program for the F-104 not only saved the project from financial disaster, but also turned it into a remarkable success for Lockheed. With production deals in place, the F-104 entered service with 14 air forces, becoming one of the closest approximations to its standard Western fighter plane. Customized fire control systems and other controls tailored for each country's version of the F-104 allow for versatile use in various roles. Despite its reputation for demanding respect and care from pilots, the F-104 also gained renown as one of the most formidable aircraft in the air. Customer air forces around the world employed the F-104 in diverse roles and continued its development until the last ones were built in 1983. As presumably everybody knows, the Germans, whose orders had been so critical, initially had a fairly miserable time with the plane, losing over 200 of them in accidents. The reason for this are many, but little blame can be appointed to the plane itself. The early deployment disaster with the Luftwaffe had complex roots, and it took time to address the underlying causes. The West Germans experienced a similar, albeit shorter, struggle when introducing the F-104 into their inventory. However, none of the other nations that purchased a starfighter had experiences remotely resembling the issues faced by Germany. It was evident that the problems primarily stemmed from the specific circumstances within the Luftwaffe at the time. To counter the mounting negative publicity surrounding the F-104, Lockheed maintained its own private starfighter as a promotional tool. This aircraft flew extensively around the world in search of orders and was later used in PR efforts to salvage the reputation of the plane. In this aircraft, Jackie Conquered, renowned for her achievements in the Bendix races of the 1930s and her service with the Women's Air Force Service Pilots during World War II, became the first female Western pilot to break the speed of sound. Kelly Johnson's design team transitioned from a plane with almost no wing to one with extraordinarily long wings, the U-2 spy plane, and then the remarkable Mach 3 SR-71 Blackbird, showcasing their innovative and groundbreaking approach to aircraft design and engineering. Both of these aircraft bear some superficial resemblances to the 104. Certainly comparing the three to the other planes of their time, it's easy to see them as stablemates, products of the one vision. Kelly Johnson, the mastermind behind these groundbreaking aircraft, retired universally respected as one of the giants of aviation. Throughout his illustrious career, his designs were consistently at the cutting edge of their time, often ahead of their time. One of Johnson's later endeavors was the redesign of the F-104, which became known as the Lancer. This revamped version, featuring larger wings and enhanced maneuverability, was proposed in a fighter competition that ultimately led to the mass production of the F-15. However, the Lancer proposal did not receive serious consideration, and no aircraft were built. Johnson maintained that the Lancer would have outperformed the F-15, with some experts agreeing and even suggesting that the F-104 itself could have posed a challenge to the F-15 in an aerial combat. Despite the F-104's early struggles, including engine availability issues and the unreliability of the J-79 engine, its testing and development phase set new standards in aviation. Major challenges like pitch-up were overcome through rigorous testing and refinement, resulting in a powerful and reliable, albeit eager and somewhat temperamental aircraft. Despite its enduring reputation for controversy, the F-104 ultimately vindicated the decisions of its creators. Throughout its lengthy career, it carved out a unique and significant place in the annals of aviation history.
The McDonnell F-101 Voodoo was a supersonic jet fighter which served in the United States Air Force and the Royal Canadian Air Force. The origins of the F-101 actually had little to do with the jobs for which it was used over its long career with the U.S. Air Force, Air National Guard, and Canadian Armed Forces. Neither tactical reconnaissance nor all-weather interception had been a factor in early 1946 when the newly formed Strategic Air Command solicited proposals for a jet-propelled strategic penetration fighter. SAC's chief criteria at the time had been sufficient range to accompany its bombers, Boeing B-29s and the soon-to-fly Convair B-36s all the way to their targets, and adequate speed and firepower to deal with enemy interceptors. 4 swept-wing designs were ultimately approved for prototype development: the McDonnell XF-88 Voodoo, Lockheed XF-90, Republic XF-91 Thunderceptor, and North American YF-93A, a development of the F-86, all of which flew between 1948 and 1950. After being awarded a contract on February 14, 1947, McDonnell built 2 prototypes, designated the XF-88 Voodoo. The first prototype, serial number 46-6525, powered by 2 Westinghouse XJ34-WE-13 turbojets, flew from Morocco on 20th of October 1948. Preliminary testing revealed that while handling and range were adequate, the top speed was a disappointing 641 miles an hour at sea level. After fitting McDonnell Design's afterburners to the second prototype, thrust was increased to 3,600 pounds with corresponding performance increases in top speed, initial rate of climb, and reduced takeoff distance. Fuel consumption was greatly increased by the use of afterburners, however, reducing the range. When a fly-off was held in the summer of 1950, McDonnell's XF-88A, an improvement over its 1948 prototype, emerged as the winner of the penetration fighter competition against the Lockheed XF-90 and North American YF-93. McDonnell's success was momentary. However, the Air Force, motivated by unexpected budget cuts, abruptly canceled the XF-88A program and made the decision to use the Republic F-84E Thunderjets as interim bomber escorts. Combat experience in Korea soon revealed that the straight-wing F-84s were not suited for air-to-air role, and the North American F-86 Saberjet clearly lacked the range to escort bombers to long-range targets. Something better was needed, so SAC, determined to protect its emerging fleet of B-36s, issued new requirements for a long-range fighter in January 1951. This time, adding specifications for parallel development of photo reconnaissance versions of the new type. Lockheed, North American, Republic, and McDonnell all submitted new proposals, joined by a bid from Northrop for a long-range version of its F-89 Scorpion. In May 1951, the Air Force announced that McDonnell's entry, basically a scaled-up XF-88A upgraded with more powerful Allison J-35A-23 engines, was the winning bidder. But before construction was authorized, the Air Force specified major changes aimed at improving overall range and performance. the most significant being the substitution of Pratt & Whitney J57P-13 power plants, which required enlarging and lengthening the fuselage to carry more fuel and house bigger engines, plus extensively revising the air intakes and related engine ducting. The greater dimensions of the J57 engines required modifications to the engine bays, and modification to their intakes to allow larger amounts of airflow into the engine. The new intakes were also designed to be more efficient at higher Mach numbers. In order to increase aerodynamic efficiency, reduce structural weight, and alleviate pitch-up phenomena recently identified in flight testing of the Douglas D-55-82 skyrocket, in aircraft with control surface configuration similar to the XF-88, the horizontal tail was relocated to the top of the vertical stabilizer, giving the F-101 its signature T-tail. When the McDonnell team, led by Edward M. Flesch, completed the final design in late 1951, the Voodoo had grown 13 feet longer and weighed twice as much as its XF-88 predecessor. The F-88 was redesignated the F-101 Voodoo in November of 1951. The F-101A would be, at the time, the largest single-seat fighter ever built, 67 feet 5 inches long and weighing over 48,000 pounds fully loaded. Although the wing had been slightly enlarged by increasing the chord of the inboard half of each panel, total area was still relatively small, 368 square feet, producing prodigious loading of 135.9 pounds per square foot, the highest of the Century series in original configuration. Internal fuel capacity increased from 734 to 2,341 gallons, augmented by two 450-gallon external drop tanks. Provisions were also made for an in-flight refueling, either via flying boom or probe and drogue systems to extend the plane's combat radius even farther. An APS-54 search radar provided all-weather capability, and heavy firepower came from four 20mm cannons, 3 Hughes GAR-1 Falcon radar homing missiles, and up to 12 unguided rockets. Before the final design was fixed, the Air Force expanded the fighter's potential mission uses by adding the capability to carry a nuclear weapon on an external rack. In late 1952, the mission of the F-101 was changed from penetration fighter to strategic fighter, which entailed equal emphasis on both the bomber escort mission and on nuclear weapons delivery. The new Voodoo mock-up with the reconfigured inlets, tail surfaces, landing gear, and dummy nuclear weapon was inspected by Air Force officials in March 1953. The design was approved. An initial order for 29 F-101As was placed on May 28, 1953. No prototypes had been required, as the F-101 was considered a simple development of the XF-88, with the Cook-Craig production policy, in which initial low-rate production would be used for testing without the use of separate prototypes, chosen instead. Not surprisingly, a decision was made to limit production to the initial procurement until military acceptance testing and evaluation was well underway. The first F-101A was completed in August 1954 and shipped to Edwards Air Force Base, where its maiden flight was on September 24th with McDonnell test pilot Robert C. Little at the controls. Early testing indicated impressive performance, a top speed of Mach 1.54, an initial climb rate of 44,100 feet per minute, a service ceiling of 49,450 feet, and a maximum range of 2,186 miles. It also revealed aerodynamic flaws that were serious enough, in May 1956, for the Air Force to halt production pending resolution of its concerns. The most serious problem was a treacherous pitch-up tendency, encountered both in high and low airspeed ranges at certain G levels with angles of attack, frequently followed by engine compressor stalls that led to loss of power or total flameout. If the pitch-up, an uncontrollable flat spin condition oscillating between 20 and 70 degrees nose-up, occurred below 15,000 feet, Voodoo pilots were under standing orders to eject. The pitch-up problem was substantially remedied by installing a pitch inhibitor, would not allow the stick to be pulled past specific points at specific speeds, and the intakes and engine ducting were redesigned to diminish the possibility of compressor stalling. After what amounted to approximately 2,000 engineering changes, the hold order on F-101A production was finally lifted in November 1956, and the type was accepted for operational service in early May of 1957. Development and testing of the photo reconnaissance version, the RF-101A, followed the fighter version by about 18 months. But, due to the setbacks in the fighter program, the photo recon versions entered the operational service at virtually the same time. The aircraft was fitted with an MA-7 fire control radar for both air-to-air and air-to-ground use, augmented by a low-altitude bombing system for delivering nuclear weapons, and was designed to carry a Mark 28 nuclear bomb. The original intended payload for the F-101A was the McDonnell Model 96 Store, a large fuel/weapons pod similar in concept to that of the Convair B-58 Hustler, but was cancelled in March 1956 before the F-101 entered service. Other operational nuclear payloads included the Mark 7, Mark 43, and Mark 57 weapons. While theoretically capable of carrying conventional bombs, rockets, or Falcon air-to-air missiles, the Voodoo never used such weapons operationally. The RF-101A made its first flight in June 1956, and differed from the fighter mainly in carrying 150 gallons of additional internal fuel and having a lengthened nose that housed 3 vertical and 2 oblique Fairchild cameras in place of the search radar and 20mm guns. The RFs shared the capability to deliver a single nuclear weapon carried on a centerline rack and were marginally faster than the Fs due to the reduced weight. F-101As became operational in May 1957, with the 27th Strategic Fighter Wing in their original bomber escort role, replacing their F-84F Thunderchief. However, by this time, SAC had decided to abandon the long-range fighter concept. Even with its above-average range, the Voodoo could not escort the bombers. B-36s, and by that time B-47s and B-52s, all the way to their intended targets. The F-101A's career might have ended then and there, but for the intervention of Tactical Air Command, which saw potential in the big fighter as a tactical nuclear weapons delivery system platform. Thus, in mid-1957, the 27th Strategic Fighter Wing became the TAC-controlled 27th Fighter Bomber Wing, and all F-101As were thereafter retrofitted with the low-altitude bombing system and other apparatus needed to complete their new function as nuclear strike fighters. By late November 1957, the last of the 77 F-101As had been delivered to the Air Force, 50 of them assigned to operational units, with the remaining 27 held for experimental and test purposes. F-101As served in a frontline role until 1966, after which they were phased out and turned over to the Air National Guard units. The first of 35 production RF-101As was delivered to the 363rd Tactical Reconnaissance Wing, TRW, at Shull Air Force Base in May 1957. It was the first supersonic reconnaissance aircraft in the Air Force inventory, and on November 27, 1957, as a part of Operation Sunrun, 4 RF-101As set a new transcontinental speed record. They flew round-trip between McGuire Air Force Base in New Jersey and March Air Force Base in California in 6 hours, 46 minutes, and 36 seconds, with an average speed of 721 miles an hour. In the mid to late 1960s, RF-101As were used as reconnaissance trainers and were all phased out of the active Air Force inventory by 1971. A few serviceable examples following the conversion to RF-101G standards were transferred to Air National Guard units. Pilots who flew the Voodoo were impressed by its performance, dubbing it the One-O-Wonder, but they also considered it very unforgiving. Colonel C. Robert Oz Osborne Jr. said, "The F-101 was a lady, a fantastic airplane, but touchy, very touchy. It had to be flown properly." Air Force test pilot Richard Baird echoed that sentiment. "It's the biggest by-the-book fighter I've ever flown. The Voodoo would bite you. You really had to fly it strictly by the book." And reconnaissance pilot Colonel Jonathan Gardner noted that, "The first ride, you didn't fly it. You hung on to it." The improved F-101C and RF-101C were both ordered in March 1956. The Cs were externally identical to the A models, but had strengthened airframes to accept a higher load limit, and, in the case of the fighter version, were equipped from the start as tactical fighter bombers. All of the 47 F-101Cs built were delivered to the Air Force in 1957 to 1958, serving with the 81st Tactical Fighter Wing as nuclear strike aircraft until they were phased out in 1965 to 1966. The F-101C was the fastest tactical fighter in operational service until the advent of the Lockheed F-104, and on December 12, 1957, a stripped-down example set a new world record of 1,204 miles an hour, or Mach 1.83. The RF-101C, built in greater numbers than its fighter counterpart, entered operational service in September 1957, and the last of 166 was delivered in March 1959. RF-101Cs saw wide service with the U.S.-based 363rd Tactical Reconnaissance Wing, the Europe-based 66th TRW, and the Far East-based 67th TRW. During the Cuban Missile Crisis in October 1962, RF-101As and Cs of the 363rd TRW flew low-level reconnaissance missions over Cuba. The RF-101C was the only Voodoo variant to see combat in Vietnam. In fact, as early as 1961, RF-101Cs of the 67th TRW, operating out of Kadena Air Force Base in Okinawa, began making surveillance flights over Laos and South Vietnam. During the same time period, 45th TRS Voodoos moved to Tan Son Nhut Air Force Base in Vietnam to cover operations in the south, and served as pathfinders for the first bombing mission against the North on February 8, 1965. Between 1965 and 1970, 33 RF-101Cs were lost to enemy anti-aircraft and missiles, and one to a North Vietnamese MiG-21. Starting in late 1967, as more RF-4Cs arrived to the takeover reconnaissance duties, Voodoos were restricted from operations over North Vietnam. They were all ultimately withdrawn from the combat zone by late 1970. Upon their return to the States, RF-101Cs were retired from active U.S. Air Force service, and many were turned over to the Air National Guard's units. In 1965, 29 F-101As and 31 F-101Cs were modified under the new designations RF-101G and RF-101H, respectively, to serve as unarmed reconnaissance aircraft with the Air National Guard units. The modification entailed removal of radar and armament and the installation of a nose cone housing cameras and new electronic components. RF-101Gs and Hs were operated by 3 Air National Guard units, the 154th TRS in Arkansas, the 165th TRS in Kentucky, and the 192nd TRS in Nevada. In early 1968, the seizure of the U.S. naval surveillance vessel Pueblo by the North Koreans led to President Lyndon B. Johnson to activate all 3 Air National Guard Voodoo units. Each served a rotational tour at Itazuki Air Force Base, Japan, and compiled impressive records, flying 19,715 tactical hours and 11,561 sorties, and exposing 831,601 feet of aerial film. The last single-seat reconnaissance Voodoos were removed from the National Guard service in 1976. The most numerically important and longest-lived Voodoo was the 2-seat all-weather fighter interceptor version, the F-101B. By the end of 1953, the Air Force's ambitious 2-step interceptor program with Convair, the Mach 1 F-102A, scheduled to be followed by the Mach 2 F-102B, redesignated the F-106A in 1956, was seriously behind schedule. An aircraft was needed to plug the gap between this so-called ultimate interceptor and the subsonic Northrop F-89 Scorpions, Lockheed F-94 Starfires, and North American F-86D Sabres, serving with Air Defense Command. ADC's expression mission was strategic defense to interrupt and destroy Soviet bombers en route to the United States before they reached our shores. Late in 1953, the Air Force asked aircraft manufacturers to submit proposals for a new missile-armed all-weather interceptor under the classification Weapon Systems WS-217A. McDonnell offered a single or 2-seat adaptation of the F-101 that would incorporate new fire control and missile systems and use more powerful Wright J67 engines, license-built copies of the British Bristol Olympus that were supposed to produce 22,000 pounds of static thrust each. The Air Force selected McDonnell's proposal in mid-1954, specifying the 2-seat version, and issued a letter of intent in March 1955 for an additional batch of 28 aircraft and potential production of 68 more. The expectation was that the first flight would take place in mid-1956, and The prototype would enter the operational service in early 1958. After the letter of intent was issued, McDonnell requested the designation F-109 for the airframe portion of the WS-217A project, but the Air Force, evidently conscious of the funding obstacles associated with the new aircraft as opposed to the improvements to the existing type, called it the F-101B. Although McDonnell had the F-101B mock-up ready for inspection by September 1955, the entire Voodoo program was put on indefinite hold while the aforementioned aerodynamic problems with the F-101A were being ironed out. Further delays and uncertainties with the J-67 engines led to a decision to use Pratt & Whitney J-57P-55 power plants, which featured longer afterburners and a thrust rating of 16,900 pounds per engine. The F-101B shared the center and aft fuselage sections and tail group of the F-101A series, and, other than bulged wheel well doors to house larger tires, the same wing platform. But the F-101B introduced a completely new, 4-foot longer forward fuselage section with a tandem cockpit layout for the pilot and radar operator. Also new was a Hughes MG tracking and fire control system, essentially an upgrade of the E-6 system already utilized in the F-89D, and a rotary weapons bay that held 4 Hughes Falcon semi-active radar and infrared missiles. The first F-101B took off from Lambert Field in St. Louis on March 27, 1957, a year behind schedule, and the Air Force spent nearly 2 more years conducting extensive tests and evaluations before releasing the Voodoo interceptors to operational service. Flight performance met expectations. A top speed of Mach 1.66, a combat ceiling of 51,000 feet, and a normal range of 1,387 miles. But the F-101B had other problems that seriously hampered its operational effectiveness. The radar operator's position was poorly designed, and little could be done to improve it other than minor adjustments. Even more worrisome, the MG-13 fire control system did not adequately control the weapons on a platform as fast as the F-101. A proposal to replace the system with the more advanced MA-1 developed for the F-106 was rejected because of the cost involved. Deficiencies notwithstanding, the F-101Bs became operational with the 60th Fighter Interceptor Squadron at Otis Air Force Base in Massachusetts on January 5, 1959. On the plus side, the 2-seater Voodoos had been extensively tested by the time they had reached ADC, and they finally gave the Air Force an interceptor capable of advanced performance at affordable cost, $1.7 million per plane, compared to $4.7 million for an F-106A. By the end of 1960, no fewer than 17 ADC squadrons were equipped with F-101Bs. Production ended in March 1961, with a total of 480 aircraft delivered. Beginning in 1959, McDonnell undertook a modification in which approximately 1 out of every 4 F-101Bs would be fitted with dual controls while retaining full AVC mission capability. Used for conversion in operational training under the initial designation TF-101B, these aircraft were redesignated F-101Fs in 1961, after 79 examples had been modified. Leak production F-101Bs boasted upgraded fire control systems and the ability to carry 2 nuclear-tipped, unguided Genie ND-1s or Air-2A missiles in place of the 2 Falcons. In a modernization program, Project Bold Journey, completed between 1963 and 1966, most F-101Bs were fitted with infrared sensors to facilitate tracking of hostile aircraft regardless of radar jamming, and also received a much improved pitch control mechanism that functioned through an automatic flight control system. F-101Bs/Fs began to be phased out of Air Force service in 1969, without having fired a shot in anger, and the last active-duty squadrons operating the type, the 60th and 62nd FIS, retired their Voodoos in April 1971. Simultaneously, F-101Bs and Fs were delivered to the Air National Guard units, starting with the 116th FIS, Washington ANG, in November 1969, and ultimately went on to fully equip 8 fighter interceptor units in 7 different states. The Air Force retained a small number of F-101Bs after 1971 for fighter interceptor training, and the last of those was retired in September 1982.
Aviation, the art of aeronautics, began with the dreamers, inventors, and daredevils who dared to defy gravity. The journey of aviation was nurtured by pioneers like the Wright brothers, whose first flight marked a historic milestone. The role of aircrafts in world wars was groundbreaking, dramatically changing warfare strategies. This initiated a technological evolution in aviation, transforming the simplistic wings of a biplane into the thunderous roar of jet engines. Let's journey through the ages of aviation. Behind every great aircraft, there were great minds. These visionaries, like Sir Frank Whittle, the innovator of the turbojet engine, redefined air travel. Then there's Skunkworks Kelly Johnson, the genius behind the SR-71 Blackbird. His designs combined speed, stealth, and power, crafting machines that dominated the heavens. The contributions of these pioneers have left an indelible mark on the canvas of aviation, shaping the course of history and inspiring generations of engineers and aviators. Each epoch in aviation history gave birth to extraordinary aircrafts, each with their own unique features and roles. The Lockheed SR-71 Blackbird was a marvel of speed and stealth. The F-105 Thunderchief, a supersonic fighter bomber, was vital in the Vietnam War. The P-51 Mustang, a long-range fighter, was critical in World War II. The P-47 Thunderbolt, a heavyweight fighter, was used extensively in the same war. The A-10 Thunderbolt II, the Warthog, is a close air support icon. The Messerschmitt Me-262 marked a leap forward in aviation technology. Each of these game changers were instrumental in their eras, and their legacies still resonate today. Beyond the game changers, there are those that have transcended their practical roles to become icons. The Concorde was not just an aircraft, it was a supersonic symbol of luxury and speed. The B-52 Stratofortress, a strategic bomber, is an icon of power and resilience. These magnificent machines and others like them have become much more than just aircrafts. They are enduring icons that encapsulate the audacious spirit, the relentless innovation, and the boundless ambition that define the world of aviation. For more amazing aerial footage, and to join us in this incredible journey, check out the Dronescapes YouTube channel.
The only reason for an airplane to exist is to go fast. At the Great Air Meet in Rheims, Glenn Curtis set a world's record of just over 43 miles an hour, and the quest for speed was on. In 1913, Maurice Prévost was flying a streamlined Dépôt-Dessin monoplane at 126 miles an hour, and Europe claimed the lead in aviation speed. Immediately after World War I, quest for speed became a catalyst for the development of fighter planes. Countries which had not invested in new engines for their wartime fighters would, for reasons of national pride, invest in new engines to race them peacetime. Then, in America in the 1930s, the situation reversed itself. Civilian aircraft, like the Travel Air Mystery Ship and the GB, Waddell Williams racers, became even faster than military aircraft. The reason was simple. Same engines were available to both civil racers and military fighters. The fighters had to carry guns, bombs, oxygen, and radios, while the racers were built only for speed. The world's absolute speed record was passed from country to country. And as the racers became faster and more powerful, they also became more expensive. America's Howard Hughes could afford to build his own racer, and with it set a land-plane speed record. But the absolute speed record of 440 miles an hour was set by a Macchi MC-72 seaplane in 1934, financed by the Italian government. Then military aircraft came back into the lead as the Heinkel and Messerschmitt firms competed for the title. Messerschmitt Bf-109R set a speed record of 469 miles an hour in 1939, a record that lasted for many years. When the jet aircraft came out, speed records rapidly accelerated, the British breaking 1,000 miles an hour in 1956 in a Fairey Delta II. Speeds continued to climb, finally reaching 2,193 miles an hour in 1976 by the Lockheed SR-71, alias Blackbird. While speed was the object, there were many other benefits in creating ever faster aircraft. Improvement in fuels, streamlining, lubricants, materials, and the list goes on. Speed produced not only prestige and pleasure, but also utility. The speed record setters ultimately paved the way for commercial transports, business jets, and private planes.